I am Cleopatra's cat. I was born beneath the warm stones of a temple in the city of Memphis, long before Cleopatra was ever named. The priests never noticed me at first. I was just another kitten, crawling through the shadows of columns, watching the dust rise as sandals passed. The year, I believe, was around 85 BC. Rome was already rising, casting its shadow far across the Mediterranean. But here, in Egypt, the air still smelled of incense and lotus flowers. People brought offerings to the gods every morning: bread, onions, even fish. I watched them place the food carefully before statues that never moved, never blinked. Priests believed cats were sacred. I learned quickly to walk softly and sit still. They called me Little Watcher. I liked the way it sounded. At night, the temple would glow with oil lamps. I'd hide near the altar, listening to the chanting. They spoke in old tongues, words I never understood, but I could hear the fear and the hope behind them. I watched as villagers came, heads bowed, begging for rain or health or the safety of their children. Sometimes I followed them home. I crept through alleys of mud brick houses where children chased each other barefoot and women carried water from the canals. Life was not easy there. The poor ate dates and lentils. Meat was rare, but they laughed often. I liked being among them. While the palace glittered on the horizon, most people lived in shadows. I learned early that the temples were full of power, but the streets were full of stories. I was a cat. I could walk in both. The Nile never shouted. It didn't roar like the seas. It flowed slowly, like a whisper across the land. I often sat on the edge of the river at dawn, tail curled beside me, watching the fishermen push out their narrow boats. They threw their nets into the water with practiced arms. Some sang to the river, soft words passed down from their fathers. The Nile had fed their people for thousands of years. It brought life, but sometimes it also brought fear. When the river rose too high, it drowned crops and homes. When it stayed low, fields cracked and dried. Every year, they waited and watched. I waited too. I wandered along the riverbanks where the papyrus grew thick. Children played there, barefoot and laughing, chasing frogs or trying to catch dragonflies. Once, a boy shared his bread with me. I sat beside him until the sun sank behind the date palms. The farmers near the Nile lived by its mood. They spoke of water like it was a god. And maybe it was. Without it, the wheat wouldn't grow. Without wheat, there was no bread. Without bread, there was hunger. I watched men dig irrigation channels with their hands. I heard women sing while grinding grain with heavy stones. I saw goats being led to drink and oxen pulling wooden plows in the mud dot up the hill. In the palace, no one touched the soil, but here, by the Nile, hands were always dirty, and hearts were always tired. Still, they smiled. The Nile flowed silently, and I kept walking beside it, paws in the dust, ears open. Before Cleopatra, before even her father or grandfather, there was a man named Ptolemy. I never met him. Of course, he died long before I was born, but his name still echoed in the temple halls. They said he came from far away from a place called Macedon, where men wore metal armor and followed a boy named Alexander. Alexander the Great, they called him. A warrior who never lost a battle. Ptolemy was his general. When Alexander died, his empire broke apart like dried mud. Each of his commanders took a piece. Ptolemy took Egypt. The people didn't choose him, but he made himself pharaoh anyway. He didn't wear the double crown like the old kings. He wore a Greek cloak and spoke a Greek tongue, but he stood before the gods of Egypt and said, "I am your ruler now." Some believed him, some didn't, but no one stopped him. He built new temples and placed statues of himself beside ancient gods. He minted coins with his face, smiling, like a god. He brought in Greek soldiers, Greek scholars, Greek builders. Alexandria, his shining city, was born on the coast, with tall towers and wide streets. But down the river in the villages, life stayed the same. Farmers still bowed to Ra. Mothers still told their children stories of Isis and Osiris. The people accepted Ptolemy, but they never forgot who they were, and neither did I. I heard old men spit when they said his name. I saw priests roll their eyes behind closed doors, but I also saw others pray for his protection when bandits threatened. The roads he ruled for many years. When he died, his children ruled after him. Then by the time Cleopatra was born, the Ptolemies had sat on Egypt's throne for almost 300 years. But they still spoke Greek in their halls, and they still weren't truly Egyptian. I was a cat. I belonged to no king, but I watched them all. By the time I began walking the alleys of Memphis, the Greek lords had been in Egypt for generations. They ruled from marble palaces with tall columns and gold-trimmed doors. But outside those gates, the mud bricks still held the weight of the people. The Ptolemies spoke Greek. Their servants spoke Greek. Their laws were written in Greek. But the farmers in the fields still prayed in Egyptian. They still called their god Amen, not Zeus. I remember sitting on a wall near the granaries. Two old men argued in hushed voices. One blamed the high taxes on the foreign rulers. The other whispered, "At least the grain still grows." That was how most people thought. They didn't love the kings. They simply endured them. The Greek soldiers patrolled the markets, sharp eyes under heavy helmets. I avoided their boots. They were not cruel, but they didn't smile either. In the city, I saw Greek merchants selling olive oil and glass from the north. Egyptian women passed by, wrapped in linen, carrying baskets of barley. They didn't speak to each other. They lived in the same land, but not the same world. Once I slipped into the courtyard of a Greek noble's home. There were fountains, tiled floors, and a boy playing with a painted wooden horse. He tossed me a fig. It was sweet, but the silence around him was colder than the stone walls. Then I returned to the streets. There, children ran barefoot, laughing, shouting. They didn't have fountains or tiles, but they had noise. They had life. The Greek lords ruled Egypt. Yes, but they didn't understand it. And Egypt quiet. Ancient Egypt never truly let them in. One morning, I followed the scent of baking bread out of the city and into the farmland. The stone roads ended, and dust took their place. My paws sank into the earth with each step. The huts were made of mud and straw, cracked from the heat. Chickens wandered freely. Goats bleated near small wells. Children chased one another between the houses, their laughter rising with the smoke from cooking fires. No one noticed me. I was just a cat. But I noticed everything. I saw the woman kneeling by the river, washing clothes with tired arms. I saw the man sharpening a wooden tool, sweat rolling down his back. I saw the boy digging in the field for beetles his lunch. Life here was quiet, but not peaceful. The sun was harsh. The work was endless. When the Nile flooded, the soil gave life. When it didn't, hunger followed. And yet, every evening, families gathered under the stars, broke flat bread, and shared whatever they had. I crept into one hut and slept in a corner. The floor was warm from the day's sun. A girl saw me, smiled, and placed a bowl of water near my head. No gold, no titles, just kindness. At night, they told stories, tales of lost gods, wandering spirits, and forgotten pharaohs. The elders spoke of better times, and the young ones listened with wide eyes. These people were not written in scrolls. No statues were built for them, but they were Egypt. Without them, there would be no kings, no temples, no pyramids. I liked it there in the mud, in the smoke, in the silence. I saw something the palace never showed: strength. In Egypt, gods live everywhere. I've seen them in stone, in gold, in the eyes of the people, and even in silence. I have walked among their feet, brushed against their altars, and watched both priests and farmers speak to them in whispers. But not all prayed to the same gods. The Greeks, who ruled from the palaces, brought their own sky. Their gods came from high mountains and sounded like thunder: Zeus, Athena, Apollo. They carved their names into marble and painted them in colors I never saw in the villages. Their gods were strong, proud, cold. The Egyptians, on the other paw, believed in gods that touched the earth. I watched a woman kneel before a small clay figure of Bastet, the cat-headed goddess. She lit a small lamp and placed a fish beside the statue. She didn't speak. She just closed her eyes. I sat beside her. I didn't move. I felt it. 2.Bastet was one of ours. In the temples, I saw statues of Ra, the sun god, with a hawk's head. At dawn, the priests stood in rows, lifting their arms toward the rising light. They sang slow, deep songs that shook the floor. They believed Ra sailed a boat through the sky each day, and through the underworld each night. If they didn't sing, he might not rise again. They believed this with all their hearts. I saw Anubis, the jackal-headed god, painted on tomb walls, guiding the dead through darkness. I once wandered into a chamber where a mummified man lay still, his arms crossed, his eyes painted open. Priests chanted for hours, walking in circles. They said his soul needed protection, and only the gods could give it. Sometimes, I would curl up near a small shrine outside a house. These were not royal homes, just farmers or fishermen, but they placed bread, onions, or even dried figs on tiny altars made of bricks. I saw them look up at the stars when no one was watching, mouths moving without sound. I wondered if the stars ever answered in Alexandria, where Greek and Egyptian life mixed like oil and water. The temples were larger, colder. There, the gods had many faces. I saw one statue that was part Zeus, part Ammon. It looked strong, but confused. The people lit fires anyway. In the village, one boy asked his mother why they still prayed when nothing changed. She didn't answer. She only told him to carry the offering before the sun set. The gods did not speak, but they were everywhere. In every wall carving, in every prayer whispered over grain, in every funeral I followed at a distance. And me, I watched. Some said we cats could see the gods. I don't know if that's true, but I saw people give their last loaf of bread too. A statue. I saw tears fall into the dirt in front of a painting on a wall. I saw hope, placed gently into the hands of something invisible. Maybe that's enough. There is no place louder than a market in the morning. The sun had barely crept above the rooftops when I padded into the square. Already, voices filled the airmen, shouting prizes, women bargaining, children running between stalls. Donkeys brayed, chickens flapped. The scent of fish, sweat, bread, dust, and dates all swirled together like a cloud you could almost chew. I liked the market. It was never quiet, never still. Unlike the temples, where everything was sacred and slow, here everything moved, everything breathed. I wove between legs and baskets, careful not to get stepped on. I knew which stall owners tossed fish guts into the street. I knew which children would try to grab my tail. I avoided them both. Merchants from across the Nile and beyond gathered here. Some came with carts pulled by oxen, others with baskets, balanced on their shoulders. There were baskets of barley, jugs of oil, dried figs stacked like bricks. Clay pots lined the walls, each shaped by a hand I'd probably seen working the mud days earlier. One man sold bronze knives. He shouted in Greek, pointing to the shine of the blade. Another beside him spoke Egyptian, offering hand-woven linen. They didn't look at each other. They shared a space, but not a language. I jumped onto a crate and sat in the shadow of a fruit stall. The woman behind it had sharp eyes and fast hands. She could count change before the buyer even spoke. I watched her scold a boy who tried to take a fig. Then I watched her quietly drop one into his hand when no one was looking. That was how things worked here. Fairness didn't come from the palace or the law. It came from people who remembered what hunger felt like. A blind man sat near the fountain, playing a stringed instrument. His voice was soft, but steady. A small bowl sat at his feet. I saw coins dropped into it. I also saw feet pass by without slowing. Every now and then, soldiers came, tall, quiet, armored. They didn't buy anything. They didn't need to. Their presence alone reminded everyone who was in charge. I saw how the merchants tensed when they passed. No one dared argue while Greek swords hung at their sides. A woman with a basket of grapes whispered to her neighbor that the new tax collector was coming soon. She heard he was cruel. The neighbor only nodded and adjusted her scarf. In the market, news moved faster than sand in the wind. I wandered past the bread sellers next. Flat, round loaves, still warm from the oven, sat in stacks. Flies buzzed. A man swatted at them lazily, more concerned with watching a dice game nearby than guarding his wares. I stole a crumb when he wasn't looking. He wouldn't miss it. In a corner near the pottery stalls, I heard a small argument. A Greek merchant accused an Egyptian boy of stealing. The boy shouted back. A crowd gathered. I slipped under a table to watch. A city guard arrived and waved his hand. The boy ran. The merchant cursed. The crowd laughed. And then, the market moved on. That was the way of the square. Nothing stayed for long. Not the food, not the music, not the fights. But I did. I sat beside the stone wall until the sun was high and the shadows vanished. Then I walked to where the leftover scraps were tossed, ate what I could, and lay beneath a cart to sleep. No scroll will ever record the name of the woman who gave the fig, or the blind man who sang, or the boy who ran from the guard. But I remember them because I was there, and I'll be there tomorrow, too. Temples in Egypt were not just buildings. They were the heart of the city, the center of power and knowledge. I often slipped through tall stone doors and long corridors lined with carvings that told stories older than any living person. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with incense. Lamps flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls. I moved quietly, careful not to disturb the priests and scribes who worked late into the night. The scribes were different from the others. They sat at low tables covered with papyrus, scrolls, writing with sharp reeds dipped in black ink. Their fingers moved swiftly, making lines and symbols that held the history, laws, and stories of Egypt. I watched a young scribe named Amos. He was serious and focused, lips pressed together as he copied the list of offerings for the gods. He wore a linen robe, stained with ink, and his hair was tied back with a strip of cloth. Sometimes he would pause and look out a small window, overlooking the Nile. His eyes were distant, as if dreaming of places beyond the river. But then he would shake his head and return to his work. The scribes were the keepers of knowledge. Without them, the words of the past would disappear like sand in the wind. They recorded everything: harvests, taxes, royal decrees, even the stories of battles and treaties. Priests came and went, whispering prayers and performing rituals. Some were stern, their faces carved with years of discipline. Others were younger, laughing quietly when no one was watching. But all believed in their duty to serve the gods. I often saw them carry offerings, bread, wine, incense, to altars, decorated with gold and lapis lazuli. They chanted ancient hymns, their voices rising and falling like the Nile itself. Outside the temple, farmers and fishermen waited patiently. They brought their own offerings, hoping for favor, a good harvest, protection from illness, safety on the river. Sometimes, I followed the priests as they led processions through the city. The streets filled with people wearing bright colors, waving palm branches, and singing songs that echoed between the stone walls. But not all was peaceful. I overheard whispers of conflict, struggles for power inside the temple walls. Some priests sought more influence, others feared losing their place. One evening, I found a young scribe crying quietly in a dark corner. He told a friend that the king demanded more taxes, and the people suffered. "How can I write words that bring pain?" he asked. I curled beside him, silent but understanding. The temples held secrets, prayers, hopes, and fears. Through their halls, history flowed like the river, sometimes calm, sometimes wild, and I walked those halls, a silent watcher. In the halls of the palace, life was different from the dusty streets and quiet farms. Here, the walls gleamed with polished stone, and servants moved quickly, carrying trays of food and water. I often prowled these halls, unseen and unheard. The air smelled of perfumes and burning oils. The sound was softer, voices lowered, footsteps careful, secrets whispered behind closed doors. One girl caught my attention. Her name was Bernice. She was a cousin to Cleopatra, part of the Ptolemy family that ruled Egypt for generations. Bernice was young and curious, but her life was not easy. She wore fine clothes and jewels, but her eyes often looked tired. I watched her sit by a window, tracing patterns on the stone with her finger. Sometimes, she spoke with the tutors who taught her Greek and Egyptian languages. I heard the teachers say she was smart and strong-willed, but also proud out at night. When the palace was quiet, Bernice would sometimes come to the garden. I would follow her silently. She liked to sit under a fig tree, looking up at the stars. She never spoke to me, but I felt she was lonely. The palace was full of people, but it could be a lonely place. Family members competed for power and favor. Alliances changed like the wind. Trust was rare. Bernice knew this well. She moved carefully, listening to the whispers of servants and advisors. Sometimes, she laughed with her friends. Other times, I saw her cry behind a curtain. The Ptolemy family was large and complicated. Bernice's story was just one thread in a long, tangled cloth. But I remember her because in a world of kings and queens, Even a girl named Bernice mattered. The air in the villages was heavy with quiet anger. I slipped through narrow alleys where voices were low but fierce. Farmers and laborers spoke in hushed tones. Afraid that the wrong ears might hear, they whispered about taxes, how the Ptolemies took more grain each year, leaving less for their families. They spoke of hunger that bit deeper than the cold, night of children's empty stomachs. One evening, I found a small group gathered near a fire. Men and women, faces tired and worn, talked of rebellion. Not loud shouts or open battles, just plans, hopes, a dream of change. I could see fear in their eyes, but also something stronger, anger and determination. A man held a wooden staff, his voice low but steady. "We cannot live like this," he said. "We must stand, or we will die forgotten." The others nodded, fingers clenched. I moved closer, careful not to be seen. I wanted to hear more, to understand, but it was dangerous. The soldiers watched the villages closely. They rode through on horses, sharp eyes scanning for trouble. I heard stories of punishments, men tied and beaten, homes burned. Despite this, the whispers grew louder. One woman told me her son was taken by soldiers. She cried silently, but said she would keep fighting. The palace knew nothing of these quiet rebellions. To them, the farmers were just numbers, crops, taxes, mouths to feed. But to me, they were the true heartbeat of Egypt, strong, brave, waiting. I walked away from the fire, the voices still echoing in my ears. The rebellion was not a roar yet, only a whisper. But even whispers can start storms that night. When the city slowed and the stars filled the sky, the priests came alive. I would hide in the shadow of temple walls and watch them gather on the rooftop terraces. They were different from the farmers and merchants I knew. Their eyes always looked upward, searching. They wore long robes of white and gold, their fingers tracing patterns in the air like they were drawing invisible maps. These priests were astronomers, but more than that, they were keepers of secrets, interpreters of the heavens. They believed the stars held the future, the fate of kings, and the fate of Egypt itself. One night, I saw a group of them pointing to the bright star, serious. They spoke quietly, but with urgency. They said its rising would bring the flood of the Nile, the flood that could mean life or death for the people. I stayed still as they recited prayers, their voices a soft hum blending with the rustling of papyrus reeds in the wind. The priests had scrolls filled with charts, symbols, and calculations. They measured time by the stars and planets. They prepared calendars so the farmers would know when to plant and harvest. But their knowledge was also power. The king trusted them. The priests told him when to go to war, when to make peace, when to offer sacrifices. I saw a young priest named Meetness, his face lit by a small oil lamp as he copied star charts into a fresh scroll. He looked tired but determined. Once, he looked at me and smiled softly, as if he knew I was watching. The priests also cared for the temples. They cleaned statues, arranged offerings, and kept the fires burning. But they were not all alike. Some were kind and patient. Others were strict and feared. At times they gathered in secret chambers, speaking in whispers about omens and visions. I could not hear the words, but I felt the weight of their fears. Outside, villagers looked to the stars too. On clear nights, I saw families sitting outside their homes, pointing at constellations and telling stories. One old woman told a child that the stars were the spirits of their ancestors watching over them. I often wondered if the priests and villagers looked at the same sky. One sky, many stories, and I, a small cat beneath it all, listened. The harbor of Alexandria was always busy, but that season, something changed. The usual sounds of fishermen's calls and creaking boats were mixed with new noises, deep, loud voices from men I had never heard before, heavy boots on wooden docks, and the rhythmic splash of oars beating the water in perfect harmony. I moved silently among the stone piers, my paws barely touching the ground as I sniffed the salty air. Massive ships towered over the city walls, their wooden hulls painted dark and strong, their sails, bright white and marked with strange symbols, stretched wide against the wind. These were ships from Romaland, far across the sea, spoken of in whispers by merchants and fishermen alike. They were different from the small fishing boats or the Egyptian trading vessels. These Roman ships carried soldiers, weapons, and new ideas. The soldiers wore heavy armor that gleamed even in the dim morning light. Their faces were stern, their eyes sharp and alert. They unloaded large crates filled with metal spears, shields, and armor. I watched as they carried these weapons carefully, their movements practiced and efficient. Around me, the people of Alexandria reacted with mixed feelings. Merchants whispered fears that Rome sought to control their city and take away their wealth. Farmers from nearby villages worried about what this would mean for their crops and families. Would they have to pay more taxes? Would their sons be forced to fight in distant wars? I followed a group of soldiers as they marched through the city streets. Their boots clattered loudly on the stone roads, causing some villagers to stop and stare. Children hid behind carts, and women pulled their shawls tighter around their heads. Near the docks, I found fishermen gathered in small groups. Their weathered faces told stories of long days at sea. They spoke quietly about the growing power of Rome and how it might change their lives. Some hoped the soldiers would bring peace and protection. Others feared the arrival of war. I crept closer to a marketplace, where traders from different lands exchanged goods. Olive oil from Greece, spices from the east, fine cloth from the cities beyond the Nile. The arrival of the Roman ships meant more trade, but also more danger. Rumors spread that Rome's armies were unstoppable. At night, I sat on the rooftop of a nearby building, watching the ships moored silently in the harbor. The moonlight reflected off their sharp prows, like giant shadows waiting to move. The city was restless. Lanterns flickered in windows as families whispered prayers for safety. The priests in the temples chanted louder, seeking favor from the gods. Farmers looked nervously toward the river, wondering if the Nile's flood would be enough to sustain their crops this year. The arrival of the Romans was more than just ships in the harbor. It was a sign that the old world was shifting. Power was moving. Alliances would be tested. Lives would change. I moved among these changes like a shadow, quiet, watching. Part of the city but never fully belonging. The ships from Rome were not just wood and sails. They were the start of a new chapter, and I was there, seeing it all. Long before Cleopatra's time, long before Rome sent its ships to the Nile, there was a boy named Alexander. I never saw him, but his story was everywhere in the stones, in the songs of travelers, and in the hopes of many. Alexander was born in Macedon, a land far to the north. They say he was strong, clever, and ambitious. From a young age, He dreamed of uniting the world. I traveled far from the warmth of the Nile to the cold mountains of Macedon in my thoughts. I followed the footsteps of soldiers and kings, hearing tales of a boy who tamed horses no one else could ride and fought battles others feared. Alexander's armies moved quickly, like the wind. He conquered lands, one after another: Persia, Egypt, and beyond. When he reached Egypt, he was greeted not as a foreign invader, but as a liberator. The priests and people welcomed him. They said he was the son of Zeus and the god Amen. They crowned him pharaoh in a great ceremony by the Nile. I imagined the celebrations, the streets full of music and colors, people bowing to the new king. But not everyone was happy. Some kings feared his power, others whispered plans to stop him. Alexander did not live long. He died young, leaving behind a vast empire and many questions. His generals fought over his lands after his death. One of them, Ptolemy, took Egypt and began the dynasty that would rule for centuries. I walked the land where Alexander once rode, feeling the stories in the dust beneath my paws. People still spoke of him as a hero, a boy who dreamed too big, and I, a small cat, heard those dreams carried by the wind. The necropolis lay just beyond the city walls, vast city of the dead, silent and cold under the moonlight. I prowled its stone streets and tombs as darkness fell, slipping through shadows and listening closely to the quiet dot at night. The living rarely came here. The necropolis belonged to those who had passed: kings, priests, common people, all resting beneath heavy stones and painted walls. I moved carefully among the tomb entrances. Some were large and grand, with towering pillars carved in honor of pharaohs. Others were small, simple chambers built for farmers and fishermen, those who had lived quiet lives and were forgotten by most. The air smelled faintly of dust and incense. I could hear the rustle of dry leaves stirred by the wind. The stars above were bright, but the silence of this place was heavy. I found a spot near an ancient burial chamber, its walls covered with scenes of daily life: people planting crops, fishing on the Nile, worshipping gods. These paintings told stories of hope, work, and faith. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound, a whisper, carried by the wind. Some say the dead speak to those who listen. I sat very still, ears perked, but only the night answered. The necropolis was a reminder of life's fragility. The people buried here had once walked the same streets, worked the same fields, and worshipped the same gods as those still alive. I thought of the farmers I had seen, the market sellers, the priests. One day they too would rest here. A distant owl called. Somewhere, a guard shifted, his footsteps echoing softly. I stayed until the moon was high, feeling the weight of history around me. The stones did not speak, but their silence was full of memory. I left the necropolis with a quiet step, knowing that life and death were parts of the same story, and I, a small cat, walked between them both. The palace was full of whispers when she came to the throne. Her reign was short, but her presence left marks that many still remember. I watched her from the shadows as she moved through the halls. She was a daughter of the Ptolemy family, part of a long line of rulers. Her name was Archino, and though she sat briefly as queen, her story is tied to the struggles for power that shaped Egypt. Archino was young, but fierce. I saw her meet with soldiers and advisors, her voice firm, though her hands sometimes trembled. The palace was a place of politics, secrets, and danger. No one could trust fully, and alliances shifted like sand. Outside the grand windows, the city bustled, but inside the palace walls, tension hung heavy. I heard the sounds of guards sharpening their swords and servants whispering hurried messages. Our time as queen was marked by conflict. Her brother and sister fought for control. Each sought support from different groups: Greeks, Egyptians, soldiers, and priests. I remember a night when I found Arsino alone in a garden. She looked at the stars with tired eyes. She spoke softly to herself, as if trying to find strength. She knew her reign might not last. The people outside had little say in these royal struggles. Farmers and fishermen continued their lives, unaware of the battles inside the palace, but the consequences reached them all. Arsino was eventually forced to flee. Her brief rule was over, but the fight for Egypt's throne continued. I followed her quietly as she left the city, disappearing into the desert's edge. Her story is a reminder that even those born to power face dangers unseen, and I, a small cat, saw it all unfold. The rulers of Egypt in this time carried two worlds within them. They were pharaohs by blood, descended from the line that ruled the land, but they spoke Greek, lived Greek customs, and often seemed strangers to the people they ruled. I moved through the palace halls, hearing voices speak in Greek while priests chanted in ancient Egyptian. This mix was a sign of a complicated time. The Ptolemaic kings and queens wore the crowns of Egypt, but their education and daily life were deeply Greek. They preferred Greek tutors, Greek art, and Greek laws. Yet, outside the palace walls, the people still spoke Egyptian and worshipped their old gods. I watched a meeting between a young pharaoh and his advisors. They discussed alliances with Greek cities and plans to maintain power. The pharaoh spoke confidently in Greek, but he also wore the symbols of the Egyptian gods, a sign to remind his people that he was their ruler. In the streets and villages, I met farmers who felt distant from these rulers. They speak a language we do not understand, one man said as he tended his fields. They wear strange clothes, but they still ask for our taxes. This gap between the rulers and the ruled was a source of tension. Some priests worked hard to keep Egyptian traditions alive. Others tried to adapt to the new Greek ways to maintain their status. I saw festivals where Greek and Egyptian gods were both honored. The city was a mix of old and new, tradition and change. The pharaoh's blood was Egyptian, but their words were Greek. This duality shaped the land's future and the lives of its people. And I, a small cat, walked quietly among these two worlds, seeing how they touched and sometimes clashed in the heart of the city. Near the winding Nile, there was a temple dedicated to Sobek, the crocodile god. I often wandered near this temple, drawn by the sounds of prayers and the strange mix of fear and respect in the people's eyes. Sobek was not like the other gods who sat quietly in temples. He was wild and powerful, a symbol of strength and danger. The priests kept real crocodiles in pools near the temple. They were large and silent, their eyes watching all who passed. I moved carefully, keeping my distance. The crocodiles did not, like visitors. The people believed Sobek controlled the waters, the floods, and the fertility of the land. When the Nile rose, they thanked him. When the waters were low, they prayed for his favor. Farmers from nearby villages brought offerings, bread, meat, and flowers to the temple. They hoped Sobek would protect their fields from drought and keep the river safe from danger. One day, I saw a group of children playing near the temple. They watched the crocodiles with wide eyes, some afraid, some curious. An old priest told them stories about Sobek's power and how the god kept Egypt safe from enemies. The temple was also a place of fear. People whispered that if Sobek was angered, he could send floods or droughts to punish them. At night, the priests lit fires and chanted prayers. Their voices rose and fell, filling the air with a steady rhythm. I sat quietly nearby, feeling the mix of reverence and fear. The sacred crocodile was a living symbol of Egypt's strength and danger. It reminded everyone that life depended on forces both seen and unseen, and I, a small cat, watched it all, understanding the balance between respect and fear. The palace was a world of secrets. Behind its tall walls and heavy doors, not everything was as grand as it seemed. I slipped through the corridors, silent and unseen, listening to the whispers that filled the air. Servants hurried past, carrying messages and food. Some spoke in hurried tones, others whispered carefully, afraid their words might be overheard. These whispers told stories of power, fear, and survival. I heard the quiet anger of a maid who feared losing her place. She spoke of plots and rumors who was favored by the queen, who was being watched by the guards in the kitchens. Cooks argued over meals fit for the royal table. The servants joked quietly about the strange habits of their masters, but they knew better than to speak too loudly. I found a small group of guards gathered near a doorway. They spoke in low voices about threats from outside rebellions, spies, and the growing shadow of Rome. They were tired, but their duty kept them alert. Sometimes, a chamberlain passed by, carrying letters sealed with royal insignia. These letters could decide the fate of many, sending people into exile or granting favors. The queen's ladies whispered secrets about alliances and betrayals. Trust was rare here, and fear was constant. Outside, the city lived its daily life, but inside the palace, danger and politics were never far. I watched a young servant girl nervously hide a small object, a ring, or a message perhaps, something that could change everything. The palace was a place where silence spoke louder than words, and a whisper could shape history. And I, a small cat, was there to hear it all. The fields were quiet that year. The rivers ran lower than usual, and the skies held back their rains. I wandered through the villages, sensing the change in the air, the heaviness that pressed on the people's shoulders. Farmers stared at dry soil cracked and broken. Their hands, once strong from work, trembled with worry. They spoke less and moved slower. Children's laughter was rare. Hunger had shadowed the homes. I followed a mother as she tried to feed her young child. The bread was thin, and the water scarce. Her eyes were tired, but she kept a brave face. In the market, prices rose sharply. Grain that once filled baskets was now scarce and costly. Traders whispered of failed harvests and distant wars that made food even harder to come by. Villagers gathered in small groups, sharing what little they had. Some prayed fervently to the gods for mercy. Others cursed the silence of the skies. The priests at the temples offered rituals to bring rain. I watched as they poured water over statues, burned incense, and chanted words I could not understand. Their faces were grave, knowing that even their prayers might not be enough. Soldiers patrolled more frequently, making sure no one stole food. Fear of punishment mixed with fear of hunger. One night, I saw a group of villagers around a fire, their faces gaunt and voices low. They spoke of leaving their homes, searching for places where the earth was still kind. The famine was silent, but deadly. It crept slowly, touching every family, every corner of the land, and I, a small cat, walked among these desperate people, feeling their pain, their hope, and their will to survive. In the vast palace, among the gilded halls and marble floors, there lived many who were unseen. One of them was a young slave girl named Nep. I often found her in quiet corners, her eyes full of dreams and silent fears. Nefret's days were long and hard. She carried water, cleaned rooms, and served food, always careful not to draw attention. Her life was ruled by the orders of others, and her freedom was a distant hope. One night I followed her footsteps as she slipped through the shadows. The palace was asleep, but Nefret's heart beat loudly with the courage she had gathered. She carried nothing but a small bundle, her few belongings, and a secret plan. The guards patrolled the halls, but she moved swiftly and silently. Outside the palace walls, the city was dark and still. I walked beside her as she passed through narrow alleys and quiet streets, blending with the night. Her escape was dangerous. If caught, punishment would be severe. But Nefret's hope for freedom was stronger than her fear. I saw her stop near the river, where fishermen's boats rested. She climbed into a small vessel, and with a gentle push, the boat drifted into the dark waters as the city faded behind her. Nefret looked toward the unknown, toward a life she could choose for herself. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she was free, and I, a small cat, witnessed the bravery of a girl who dared to escape. The quiet of the desert was shattered by sounds of battle. I prowled near a small village at the edge of the sands when soldiers arrived. Their armor gleamed in the sun, and their voices carried commands that made the villagers tremble. The people of the village were farmers and shepherds, simple folk who worked the land and cared for their animals. They had little to defend themselves, and fear was their first weapon. I saw the soldiers march through the dusty streets, their footsteps heavy and sure. They searched houses, shouting orders and dragging some men away. The villagers gathered in small groups, whispering prayers and tears. Women held their children close, and old men looked on with sadness. There was no grand battle, but the soldiers' presence was enough. They crushed any sign of rebellion before it could grow. One night, I witnessed a harsh punishment. A man accused of speaking against the rulers was tied to a post in the village square. The soldiers beat him, while the villagers watched in silence, afraid to intervene. The blood stained the sand, a silent warning to all. Yet, even in this fear, I saw courage. Some villagers secretly helped those hunted by soldiers. Others planned quietly to protect their homes. The land was harsh, and so were the rulers, but the spirit of the people was stronger than the fear. And I, a small cat, moved among them all, seeing pain, fear, but also quiet hope. The temples were once the heart of the city. The gods' statues stood tall, watching over the people with silent eyes. I often wandered among these grand buildings, sensing the power and faith that filled their walls. But times were changing. I saw how the old gods, once honored by every man and woman, slowly lost their hold. New beliefs and rulers brought different gods, new stories, and different ways to worship. Some temples were abandoned, their walls cracked and faded. Statues lay broken or covered in dust. Priests who once served with devotion now spoke quietly, unsure of their place. I watched villagers hesitate as they passed these places. Some still prayed, holding offerings in trembling hands. Others walked by without a glance. In the markets and homes, I heard people talk about new gods from foreign lands. Some embraced them with hope, while others clung tightly to the old ways. The city was a place of change where faith and tradition met in uneasy balance. I saw festivals where the old and new gods were both honored, sometimes side by side. But I also saw anger. Those who worshipped the old gods feared being forgotten. They whispered that the gods' power was fading, and with it, the protection of the land. One night, I sat near a temple that once shone with light. Now it was dark and empty. The silence was deep. I felt the weight of history, a cycle of belief and loss, and I, a small cat, watched the gods fall and rise, knowing that faith was always changing. In the palace halls, I saw golden cups filled with dark red wine. Servants moved quickly, pouring drink after drink for the nobles, whose laughter echoed through rooms decorated with polished marble and silk curtains. The plates were full, the music constant. Every meal was a feast. But outside those walls, the story was different. I wandered through the narrow streets of Alexandria, where dusty feet moved over cracked stones and tired eyes searched for clean water. Buckets were lowered into wells that were nearly dry. Children cupped their hands, hoping for a few drops. Women waited in long lines, guarding their clay jars from others just as desperate. In the villages along the Nile, the farmers spoke quietly as they passed empty fields. The floods had not come as they once did. Wells dried early, crops failed, even the cats grew thinner. I sat on a rooftop and watched the contrast. Glowing lanterns in the palace versus oil lamps flickering weakly in poor homes. At banquets, I saw nobles spilling wine on the floor in drunken carelessness. But in the slums, I watched a boy cry when his mother poured the last of their water into a pot of old grain. The rulers sent no help. They hosted games and performances, invited Greek poets and Roman generals. The guests were fed figs and honey, while the streets outside echoed with hunger. A merchant in the market said, "We starve so they may drink." One day, I followed a group of workers near the harbor. They carried heavy loads, their backs bent from long hours. One collapsed under the weight, and no one stopped. Life was cheap. Later, in the palace, I heard a guest laugh and say, "Egypt is beautiful when you're at the top." But I had seen both sides. I had slept in the kitchens of the palace and the barns of the farmers. I knew the taste of feast and the smell of famine. There were two Egypts, one for the rich, where wine flowed like the Nile, and one for the poor, where water was a treasure. And I, a small cat, walked between them. The palace was quieter than usual that night. Torches burned low, and the guards stood alert but still. Inside, whispers filled the halls, whispers of birth. I crept through the shadows, my paws silent on the cool stone floors. Servants rushed past me, their eyes wide with worry and hope. Somewhere deep inside the palace, a queen cried out. Moments later, I heard the sound of a baby's first breath. A girl had been born. The midwives wrapped her in linen and held her close. The queen, though exhausted, smiled faintly. The king was not present. He had been traveling or hiding. No one was sure, but it didn't matter. The birth of a royal child was always a moment to remember. I slipped into the chamber and watched. From the corner, the baby was small, her skin soft and warm. Her eyes opened for a moment, dark and alert. She didn't cry long. She was calm, almost curious. The nurses said she was different already. They called her Cleopatra. In the following days, the palace buzzed with quiet excitement. Priests came to bless her. Astrologers studied the stars and whispered predictions to the scribes. This one, they said, may be stronger than the rest. But outside the palace, things were not so calm. People grumbled about taxes. The Nile's flood had been weak. Bread was scarce. Some whispered that the royal family cared more about Greek plays than Egyptian prayers. Still, the birth of a royal child gave some hope. Maybe this girl will change things, an old servant said while sweeping the halls. I followed the wet nurse as she carried Cleopatra through the palace gardens. The baby blinked at the sunlight and yawned. The birds sang above, and the trees swayed gently. She was born into two worlds, Greek by blood, Egyptian by land, and I, a small cat, lay near her cradle, listening to the sounds of a kingdom that would one day know her name. In the weeks after Cleopatra's birth, the palace changed. It was not louder, nor busier, but the energy shifted. The servants spoke differently when they passed each other in the halls. The guards stood straighter. The priests visited more often, and everywhere I went, I heard the same thing again and again. They say she will be different. I followed the nurse who cared for her. The woman hummed old songs while feeding Cleopatra, rocking her gently in her arms. "You'll be smarter than the others," she whispered. "Not just pretty and proud. You'll see." I watched from high windowsills and warm corners of the nursery. Cleopatra was alert, even as an infant. She watched the faces around her closely, blinking with long, careful stares. She rarely cried without reason, and her little hands were always reaching, grasping at fingers, at fabric, at light. The astrologers had said the stars were in a rare position the night she was born. One of them, an old priest who walked with a cane, whispered to a young scribe, "This child has fire in her chart. She will not be ruled." I followed him later that day as he walked through the temple corridors. He told another priest, "This girl may challenge the order of things." Of course, she was still just a baby, wrapped in cloth, with no crown, no voice, no army. But even babies carry futures. Outside the palace, the people spoke too. I heard a baker in the market say, "Another royal child. What does it matter?" His wife replied, "This one's different. They say she stares like a judge." The man grunted, "Then maybe she'll see what we live through." I walked through the muddy streets that evening. A man boiled weeds for soup. A woman nursed a baby with sunken cheeks. Their lives did not change because a girl was born in the palace, but still, the rumors spread. She will be different. Back in the palace, I returned to the nursery. Cleopatra lay awake, blinking at the ceiling. A servant whispered as she changed her cloth, "Maybe you'll listen to the people one day. Maybe." And I, a small cat, curled once more beside her, wondering if the whispers would one day be true. In a quiet chamber near the eastern wing of the palace, far from the noise of politics and the weight of royal duties, Cleopatra slept in a cradle carved from cedar wood. The cradle was lined with fine linen from Syria and smelled faintly of fresh milk and rose oil. I curled beside it, my body pressed against the warm stones beneath. The air was calm here. It was one of the few places in the palace untouched by the urgency of power. Each day, different people came to look at her. Wet nurses, noble ladies, and high-ranking priests stood silently and watched. Some bowed, some crossed their arms, and others just stared. But none of them truly knew her. Not yet. I did. I saw how she blinked more slowly when a harp was played nearby. I noticed how she reached toward the sunlight filtering through the latticework windows. I saw how she smiled rarely, but intentionally at certain voices, and how she grew restless when some nobles came near. She wasn't like the other royal infants I had seen. I'd watched many babies grow up in this palace, princes and princesses, loud and spoiled, with soft hands and empty eyes. But Cleopatra was already watching, listening. The nurses said she responded to sounds earlier than expected. The physicians checked her limbs and eyes and said she was strong, too strong for her size. They didn't know she had already grasped my tail more than once with surprising firmness. Each night, after the oil lamps were dimmed and the last prayers were spoken, I would leap up to the edge of her cradle. I never touched her, only watched. Her breath rose and fell softly. Sometimes she stirred in her sleep and made small sounds, as if dreaming already. The palace felt like a fortress. But even here, danger crept in through whispers. I heard talk of enemies, of jealous siblings, of nobles who wanted the king gone. And I heard plans, always plans made by people who thought they controlled the future. But the future was here, asleep beside me, wrapped in linen, and I, a small cat, stayed close, not because I was told to, not because I was fed scraps from the royal kitchen. I stayed because I felt if this child was not ordinary, the palace would change, the kingdom would change, and I would be here, watching every step. The palace was full of children, not the kind who played freely in the streets or chased each other through open fields. These children wore silk, learned many languages, and were taught to smile only when needed. They were princes and princesses' heirs, rivals, and shadows of future conflict. I often watched them from above, perched on stone ledges, or sleeping beneath marble benches. One knew their names long before they spoke mine. There was Bernice, the eldest daughter from another mother, sharp-eyed, proud, always walking 2 steps ahead of the others. The nurses whispered that she had a temper stronger than her father's, an ambition to match it. Then there was Arsinoe, clever, quiet when people watched, but loud when no one did. She pinched servants when they turned their backs and smiled sweetly when they faced her. She copied what she saw, whether kindness or cruelty. Ptolemy the boy was still small when Cleopatra began to walk. He was soft-spoken then, easily distracted by toys and sweets. But even in him, I saw the early signs of jealousy, how his eyes narrowed when Cleopatra sat too close to their father. And Cleopatra, she was learning fast. She spoke Greek and Egyptian from an early age. She listened more than she talked. The tutors said she asked questions no one expected from a child. When lessons ended, the siblings sometimes played in the garden, but even those games had rules. Who would lead? Who would follow? Who would stay quiet? I saw it all. Bernice pushing Arsinoe out of the way. Arsinoe whispering lies to the nurses. Ptolemy refusing to share his papyrus scrolls. But Cleopatra, she rarely reacted. She observed. She adapted. She spoke when it mattered. One afternoon, I sat beneath a fig tree as Cleopatra and Arsinoe argued over a painted doll. Arsinoe grabbed the doll first, holding it tightly. Cleopatra didn't snatch it back. She simply turned to a nearby servant and asked for another doll, one that belonged to Berenice. It was a small act, but it caused a ripple. Later that evening, I heard shouting in the women's quarters. Small fights became big ones. Blame shifted. Trust weakened. I stretched and yawned. These children were not just siblings. They were rival-strained to outthink, outplay, and someday, perhaps, destroy one another. The palace did not raise them with love. It raised them with strategy. And I, a small cat, watched them grow, day by day, into pieces on a game board that would decide the fate of Egypt. The palace was full of children, not the kind who played freely in the streets or chased each other through open fields. These children wore silk, learned many languages, and were taught to smile only when needed. They were princes and princesses' heirs, rivals and shadows of future conflict. I often watched them from above, perched on stone ledges or sleeping beneath marble benches. One knew their names long before they spoke mine. There was Bernice, the eldest daughter from another mother, sharp-eyed, proud, always walking 2 steps ahead of the others. The nurses whispered that she had a temper stronger than her father's, an ambition to match it. Then there was Arsinoe younger, clever, quiet when people watched, but loud when no one did. She pinched servants when they turned their backs, and smiled sweetly when they faced her. She copied what she saw, whether kindness or cruelty. Ptolemy, the boy, was still small when Cleopatra began to walk. He was soft-spoken then, easily distracted by toys and sweets. But even in him, I saw the early signs of jealousy, how his eyes narrowed when Cleopatra sat too close to their father. And Cleopatra, she was learning fast. She spoke Greek and Egyptian from an early age. She listened more than she talked. The tutors said she asked questions no one expected from a child. When lessons ended, the siblings sometimes played in the garden, but even those games had rules: who would lead, who would follow, who would stay quiet. I saw it all. Bernice pushing Arsinoe out of the way, Arsinoe whispering lies to the nurses, Ptolemy refusing to share his papyrus scrolls. But Cleopatra, she rarely reacted. She observed. She adapted. She spoke when it mattered. One afternoon, I sat beneath a fig tree as Cleopatra and Arsinoe argued over a painted doll. Arsinoe grabbed the doll first, holding it tightly. Cleopatra didn't snatch it back. She simply turned to a nearby servant and asked for another doll, one that belonged to Berenice. It was a small act, but it caused a ripple. Later that evening, I heard shouting in the women's quarters. Small fights became big ones. Blame shifted. Trust weakened. I stretched and yawned. These children were not just siblings. They were rivals trained to outthink, outplay, and someday, perhaps, destroy one another. The palace did not raise them with love. It raised them with strategy. The king was often gone. Even when he was in the palace, it didn't feel like he was truly there. His name was Ptolemy the 12th. Some called him Ilitz the flute player because he loved music more than ruling. I saw him walk through the palace with heavy robes and tired eyes. Servants bowed quickly, but when he passed, they spoke in low voices. He drinks too much, one said. He listens more to Rome than to Egypt, said another. He spends money we don't have. He smiled often, but it looked forced. His steps were slow. His decisions came late. Sometimes he laughed too loud. Other times he sat for hours without speaking. Cleopatra was still a child, but she was watching. I saw her listen when the priests visited. I saw her stay quiet when the king shouted at his advisors. She noticed the way others looked at him without respect. The taxes kept rising. People in the city were angry. Farmers in the villages were desperate. Some said the temples were running out of gold. Some soldiers hadn't been paid for months. One day, I followed a scribe carrying scrolls to the king's chamber. He waited outside, while voices argued behind the door. "We need more." "From the people," a voice said. "They have nothing left to give," another answered. Later that week, the king left the palace without much warning. He said he was going on a diplomatic trip to Rome, but many knew it was not just a visit. He needed their support. He needed protection, and he left his children behind. In the halls, the servants whispered louder. "He's afraid," one of them said. "He doesn't trust his own court." Another replied, "If he stays away too long, someone else might take the throne." I watched as the daily routine shifted. The queen's room stayed closed. The guards at the treasury doubled. Nobles gathered more often in private. Even the younger children noticed. Arsino asked why the palace was so quiet. Ptolemy looked worried, but said nothing. Cleopatra didn't ask. She simply followed the nurse to her next lesson. It was clear, even to me. The king's grip on power was slipping, and others were waiting to fill the space he left behind. I was sitting under a low marble table in the grand hall when I first smelled them foreign oils, strong wine, and the heavy dust of travel. The Romans had arrived. Their sandals scraped the floor differently. Their steps were louder, more certain. Their cloaks were thicker than ours, their words rougher. I followed the noise as they passed, tail low, ears up. There were 4 of them. One carried a scroll. Another kept a hand on the hilt of his sword, even inside the palace. The guards bowed to them too quickly. One servant spilled water when he saw them. I slipped between his legs and into the next room. The Romans didn't bow to anyone, not even the king. When they entered the throne hall, I jumped up onto the base of a column. From there, I could watch everything. The king forced a smile and welcomed them. He offered dates and wine. They sat without waiting to be told. One of them leaned forward and said something that made the king's smile vanish for a moment. Later, in the courtyard, the same Roman stood near a fountain. I crept behind a potted plant and listened. "He owes us," the Roman said. "We want the payments on time. No delays." Another Roman tossed a coin into the water and said, "This land is too rich to be ruled by musicians." I sneezed. The dust had caught my nose. They turned, but I had already run under the nearest bench. That evening, the palace was restless. Doors opened and closed more often. I slipped into the kitchen, where the cooks argued in whispers. "They want gold," one said, "and ships." "They want Egypt," another muttered. I padded into the servants' quarters. A maid sat with her hands shaking, saying, "I don't like how they look at us, like we're nothing." I brushed against her leg. She didn't even notice. The next day, Cleopatra stood with her tutor in the library. I lay near the window, sun on my fur, but I listened. The tutor pointed to a map. "That is Rome," he said. "If they want something, they take it." Cleopatra was quiet. Then she asked, "Will they take us too?" I walked over and climbed into her lap. She stroked my head without looking away from the map. That night, I followed one of the Romans. As he walked alone through the garden, he didn't see me crouched in the shadows. He looked up at the palace windows and said to himself, "One day, this will belong to us." I arched my back and hissed softly. He didn't hear it. The king left one morning, just as the sun began to rise. I watched from the windowsill as his carriage rolled through the gates, dust rising behind it. The guard stood stiff, but their eyes were full of questions. Days turned into weeks. The palace felt emptier. The halls were quieter. I wandered the corridors, noticing how the servants whispered behind closed doors. Some looked worried, others kept their heads down. Cleopatra's tutors came and went, but the lessons lost their meaning. She sat by the window more often, staring at the empty road where the king had gone. Her siblings noticed too. Ptolemy grew restless and angry. Orsino's smiles faded. Even Bernice paced the halls with a sharp step, speaking in low tones with the advisors. One evening, I found Cleopatra sitting alone in the garden. She traced patterns in the dirt with her finger. I rubbed against her leg, but she didn't look down. Her eyes were distant, thoughtful. The servants were more nervous. A guard stumbled through the kitchens, shouting orders. A noblewoman whispered to a maid about threats to the throne. One night, I heard shouting near the treasury. Voices clashed words about power and fear. I stayed hidden, but listened. Plans were being made, alliances tested, but Cleopatra remained quiet. She watched. She waited. I stayed near her cradle at night, feeling the tension in the air. The king had left. No one knew when or if he would return, and the palace was a house without its master. The palace felt like a cage for the children. I watched Cleopatra, Arsinoe and Ptolemy move through endless halls, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors. One afternoon, I was chasing a loose thread near the tapestry when Cleopatra appeared. She stopped and gently reached down to stroke my fur. I twisted and rubbed against her hand, purring softly. She smiled, but her eyes were heavy. She was waiting for news, waiting for change. I followed her as she joined her siblings in the garden courtyard. The three of them sat in silence on a stone bench, their legs dangling above the gravel. Ptolemy kicked at the stones, his face red with frustration. Arsinoe chewed on a piece of bread, watching Cleopatra closely. Cleopatra, however, stared at the sky, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on her lap. Suddenly, a court servant hurried by, carrying a sealed scroll. The children's eyes followed the figure, and I slipped between Cleopatra's legs as she stood up to follow. They reached the council chamber, where voices could be heard arguing inside. I squeezed through the slightly open door and hid beneath a chair. Inside, nobles spoke of the king's absence and the future of Egypt. Some wanted to act quickly, others urged patience. One man slammed his fist on the table, saying, "We cannot wait forever. The throne must be protected." A woman replied calmly, "Patience is the only way." I darted out before they noticed, weaving between the legs of officials and servants. Outside, Cleopatra stood quietly, her gaze fixed on the palace walls. Later, in the dim light of the nursery, Cleopatra played with me, pulling my tail gently and laughing softly. Her laughter was rare, but genuine. I felt her hope and her fear in the nights that followed. I prowled the halls and discovered secret passages hidden, doors behind tapestries, narrow staircases that twisted beneath the palace. I darted through these dark paths, exploring places no one else dared. Sometimes, I heard distant music and voices from forbidden rooms. Once, I even slipped into the king's private study, where papers were scattered and candles burned low. The children didn't know these passages, but I did. I watched them walk unknowingly over the walls I had explored, and so, the children waited not just for the king, but for their futures. I was there, weaving through shadows and light, living the wait with them. The palace corridors grew colder as the days passed. I could feel the tension in the air like the calm before a storm. People moved quickly, glancing over their shoulders. Secrets hung thick around the stone walls. One morning, I slipped into the servants' dining hall. The room was crowded, but I found a spot near the legs of a man who spoke low and fast. He didn't notice me as I weaved through chairs and tables. "He wants the throne for himself," the man said. "He spreads rumors to weaken the queen." Another voice responded, "The children are still young. It's a dangerous time." I followed the man as he left the hall, slipping into the shadows beside him. He met a woman near the fountain. Her face was serious, eyes sharp. "She trusts no one," he whispered, "not even her own family." They talked quietly, but I caught pieces of words: betrayal, alliances, power. Later, I crept into the royal library. The room smelled of old paper and dust. There, a group of nobles discussed plans over maps and scrolls. I sat on a windowsill, tail wrapped around my paws, watching as one man pointed to distant lands. "Rome is not far," he said. "They wait for us to fall." Suddenly, footsteps echoed. I darted behind a curtain as a young guard entered. He looked nervous and checked the door twice. Outside, I found Cleopatra playing with a small wooden horse. She didn't smile, but her eyes showed something else: resolve. That night, I prowled the palace garden. The moon was full, but the shadows were longer. I followed a figure dressed in dark robes. He whispered to another man, "The queen must be controlled, or she will ruin us all." I hissed softly, my fur standing on end. The palace was no longer a safe place, but Cleopatra was still a child, and she did not know the full weight of the games around her. I stayed close, watching, learning, waiting. The days grew longer, and the sun shone brighter on the palace walls. I watched Cleopatra in the morning light, her small hands tracing the patterns on the floor. She was growing, learning to speak more clearly, to watch more carefully. One morning, I followed her to the temple. The priests were busy preparing for a ceremony. I slipped through the open doors and hid behind a column, my eyes fixed on the girl. She knelt quietly, listening to the chants. The air smelled of incense and burning oils. The priests spoke of change, of new rulers, new gods, and new hopes. Some whispered that Cleopatra's birth was a sign of this new dawn. Outside the temple, I saw farmers tending their fields. The Nile was rising again, and the land looked healthier. The people talked softly about better times to come. Children ran through the mud, laughing back in the palace. Whispers of alliances and marriages floated through the halls. Cleopatra's tutors spoke of her future, how she would learn to speak many languages, to understand politics, to rule. I watched her sit beside her mother, listening closely. Sometimes she asked questions that made the adults pause. One day, I found her alone in the garden, staring at the horizon. I curled beside her, sensing her thoughts were heavy. The palace was a place of power and danger, but also of hope. I saw in Cleopatra's eyes a promise that she might change this world, and I stayed close, ready to see what the future would bring. The palace stirred early in the morning. Voices echoed through the halls. Footsteps hurried on the marble floors, and the smell of fresh bread mixed with incense filled the air. I slipped through the shadows, following the sound of a young girl's voice. Cleopatra was awake. She was no longer a baby, but still small, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Today was important. Tutors arrived with scrolls and tablets. Nobles came to observe, and servants moved quickly to prepare the rooms. I found her in a sunlit chamber, seated on a low stool. She listened carefully as a tutor spoke of kings and queens, of laws and battles. Her fingers played with a small wooden toy, but her eyes never left the teacher. Between lessons, she walked in the garden. I ran ahead, leaped on a stone wall, and watched as she traced the shapes of leaves and flowers with her fingers. Sometimes, she stopped to listen to the distant sounds of the city, merchants calling, children laughing, workers hammering. Power was not just about the palace walls. It was out there too, in the noise and lives of the people. The older children teased her sometimes. Ptolemy said she was too quiet, too serious. Arsinoe laughed when Cleopatra failed to catch a ball, but she didn't react. She watched them instead, learning which words led to anger and which brought smiles. In the evenings, the tutors spoke in low voices about alliances and threats. I hid behind the heavy curtains, listening without being seen. One night, a man said, "The girl must learn fast. The throne will not wait." Cleopatra's mother nodded, but said little. I curled up near the window, watching the stars. A future queen was growing, but the path was not easy. The morning light filtered through tall windows as Cleopatra sat at a large wooden table covered with scrolls. Her tutors spoke of rulers who led with wisdom and strength. I sat on the edge of the table, weaving between her fingers, feeling her small hands gently stroke my fur. Sometimes she paused and frowned. The lessons were hard laws, diplomacy, history, and the weight of decisions she would have to make one day. I saw her bite her lip, frustrated by some stories of betrayal and war. Outside, the garden was alive. Birds sang, and children played. But inside, the palace was filled with the quiet tension of preparation. Cleopatra stood and walked to a window. I jumped onto the sill and watched as she looked out toward the Nile. I could feel her thoughts, heavy and serious, far from childish games. That day, I followed her as she met with her mother and the royal advisors. Their voices were low but firm, filled with plans and warnings. Cleopatra listened, nodding, asking questions with a maturity that surprised the adults. Later, as the sun set, she practiced speaking before a small mirror, shaping her voice to sound confident and clear. I rubbed against her feet, offering comfort. She smiled faintly at night. When the palace quieted, I found her alone in a hallway, pacing softly. I brushed against her legs, and she stopped, looking down at me. For a moment, her serious expression softened. Power was coming, and she was learning what it meant. The palace was a maze of whispers and secrets. I slinked through dark corridors, slipping past guarded doors and listening close to the hurried voices of nobles and servants. One afternoon, I found myself near the council chamber. The heavy wooden door was cracked open. Inside, men and women argued over maps and letters. I slipped inside and hid under a table, my ears twitching. "The queen must be cautious," a man said. "Enemies lurk everywhere." Another whispered, "Her brothers plot against her." I darted out just before a guard passed, weaving between legs and darting through shadows. Later, I prowled the kitchens, where servants exchanged worried glances. "The family is divided," one whispered. "The throne will be taken by force, if needed." I rubbed against the ankle of a young maid who shushed the others. She looked down and smiled briefly at me before returning to her tasks. The next day, I followed Cleopatra as she walked through the palace gardens. She stopped beside a statue of the goddess Isis and touched its cold stone hand. I jumped up to her shoulder, purring softly. She whispered, I will have to be strong, no matter what. I nuzzled her neck. The palace was full of dangers, but also of hope. And Cleopatra was learning to walk the line between both. One morning, the air in the palace shifted. I noticed unfamiliar faces and voices as Roman envoys arrived. Their armor gleamed under the sun, and their language sounded sharp and strange. I followed them cautiously, keeping low among the courtiers in the great hall. They stood before the king and queen, speaking with confidence. The Romans were not like the Egyptians or Greeks. Their eyes were cold, their smiles tight. I circled around the room, brushing against the legs of noblemen and servants alike. Cleopatra watched quietly, her eyes narrowing. I jumped to her lap, sensing her tension. The Roman leader spoke of alliances, debts, and control. I heard words like power, Rome, and submission. After the meeting, I trailed the Roman envoys to the palace gardens. They whispered plans and warnings. One of them tossed a coin into the fountain and said, "Egypt is a prize to be won." I hissed softly, but they did not notice. The palace had become a stage for larger forces. Cleopatra touched my fur and whispered, "We must be careful." I stayed close, ready to watch what would come next. The palace walls held many secrets, but none as loud as the fights between Cleopatra and her siblings. I watched from the shadows as small arguments grew into silent battles. One day, I followed Arsino as she stormed down the hall, her footsteps heavy. She was angry because Cleopatra had been called to speak with their mother alone. I darted under a table just in time to avoid a throne cushion. Later, Ptolemy tried to take a scroll Cleopatra was reading. She pulled it back quickly, eyes sharp. I leaped between them, hissing softly to break the tension. At night, I curled near Cleopatra's bed. She whispered to me about feeling alone and unsure. I rubbed against her cheek, offering silent comfort. The siblings competed for attention, for favor, and for power. The palace was a battlefield disguised as a home, but Cleopatra learned quickly. She watched their moves, counted their words, and planned her own. I stayed close, watching every step. The palace was far from the fields and villages where most lived, but I was free to roam. I slipped through open gates and followed dusty paths to watch the lives of the people. Farmers worked under the hot sun, their hands cracked from soil and sweat. Women carried water from the Nile, balancing heavy jars on their heads. Children ran barefoot, their laughter rising like birdsong. They talked about the palace, about the rulers who lived behind thick walls. Some whispered hope that the young princess would bring change. Others spoke of fear of taxes and wars that never ended. One old man sat by a well, telling stories of past kings and queens. I curled beside him, warm in the sun. He stroked my fur and said, "A good leader listens." In the market, I slipped between baskets of dates and figs. Traders argued over prices, while mothers watched their children closely. I brushed against a girl's leg. She smiled, but didn't stop working. Back in the palace, I watched Cleopatra learn these stories. She asked her tutors about the people, about their lives. She listened more than she spoke. The world outside was noisy and hard, but it was real, and Cleopatra needed to understand it. One cool morning, I prowled the palace halls as usual, when a new presence caught my attention. A tall man, dressed in rich robes, entered the court. His steps echoed confidently. Servants whispered his name. He was an important advisor from a neighboring land. I slinked close, weaving between the legs of nobles, listening to their cautious greetings. The man spoke calmly, but with authority. Cleopatra's mother met him, their words low and serious. Later, I found Cleopatra watching from behind a curtain. Her eyes were curious, but wary. The man's presence changed the air in the palace. Some felt hope, others suspicion. That evening, in the garden, I saw the man speak quietly with Cleopatra's tutors. I crept closer, hearing words like alliance, protection, and power. Cleopatra approached and placed a hand on the man's arm. I rubbed against her leg, sensing her searching for strength in this new figure. But not everyone trusted him. I heard a servant mutter, "We don't know his true intentions." At night, I prowled the shadows, watching nobles speak in hushed tones. The palace was a chessboard, and this new ally was a key piece. Cleopatra's journey to power was becoming more complex, and I was there to see every move. The city was alive like never before. Bright colors adorned the streets, and the air was thick with the scent of flowers and spices. I darted through the crowds, weaving between sandals and robes, my paws silent on the stone. The festival of the Nile was a time of joy and hope. People gathered to celebrate the river that gave life to their land. Musicians played harps and flutes, and dancers spun in swirling skirts. Children chased each other, their laughter ringing like bells. In the palace courtyard, Cleopatra watched from a balcony, her small hands gripping the stone railing. I jumped up beside her, purring softly. She smiled faintly, but her eyes were serious. Outside, farmers and merchants sold their goods. I rubbed against an old woman's leg, and she smiled, stroking my fur. People spoke of the river's rise, of promises for a good harvest. But beneath the celebrations, whispers of worry moved through the crowd. Some feared the power struggles in the palace. Others dreaded the growing influence of Rome. Later, as the sun set, the festival lights reflected on the Nile's surface. I lay on the warm stone steps, watching Cleopatra's face soften in the flickering glow. The river flowed steady and strong. So did the hopes for the future. Night fell heavy over the palace. The bright halls grew dark and quiet, but I was wide awake. The shadows were my world. I slipped silently through narrow corridors, my paws barely making a sound on the cold stone. Behind closed doors, whispered voices carried secrets and schemes. Near the throne room, I paused as two men spoke in hushed tones. "The queen is growing stronger," one said. "We must control her before she controls us." The other laughed, softly, "Or remove her, if needed." I darted away before they noticed, weaving through the maze of rooms and tapestries. In the kitchens, I found a frightened servant hiding a letter. I brushed against her hand, and she shivered. Her eyes told stories of fear and hope all at once. Later, I followed the palace rat as it scurried into a hidden passage. Curious, I slipped inside too. The dark tunnel twisted beneath the palace walls. Voices echoed plans to take power, alliances, breaking secrets traded. I emerged in a forgotten chamber filled with old scrolls. Dust covered the walls, but the air was thick with history. The palace was more than stone and gold. It was a battlefield of shadows, and I was right in the middle. The day had come. The palace buzzed with preparation. Voices rose in hurried excitement, and the scent of fresh oils and incense filled every corner. I prowled through the halls, my tail twitching with anticipation. Cleopatra, no longer a child, walked through the grand corridors with a new grace. Her eyes held a quiet fire mix, of determination and uncertainty. She paused before the great throne, her fingers brushing the carved wood. I rubbed against her legs, purring softly, offering comfort for the weight she was about to bear. The ceremony was magnificent. Priests chanted in ancient voices. Nobles and dignitaries gathered in robes of gold and silk. Cleopatra sat on the throne, her posture straight and proud. I watched from the shadows, weaving between the feet of guests. I saw the eyes that looked upon her, some with respect, others with envy or fear. Afterwards, the palace shifted. The air was heavy with new rules and expectations. Cleopatra met with advisors and generals, her voice steady and clear, but I knew it was only the beginning. Later that night, I curled at her feet as she sat alone, gazing out the window at the stars. The future was uncertain, but she was ready to face it. I stayed close, a silent witness to the rise of a queen. The palace was alive with tension and excitement. I slipped through the marble halls, my paws silent on the cold floors. Today was the day Cleopatra would become queen. She moved with a calm I had not seen before. Her eyes scanned the faces around her advisors, guards, nobles, each carrying their own hopes and fears. I brushed against her ankle as she paused before the throne room. Inside, the ceremony was grand. Priests chanted ancient hymns, incense. Smoke curled in the air, and nobles in rich robes murmured prayers. Cleopatra sat on the throne, her posture strong but her gaze thoughtful. I noticed the whispers among the crowd, some filled with loyalty, others with doubt. A servant poured wine at her feet, and she nodded politely. After the ceremony, I followed her to the council chamber. The advisors spoke in low voices, discussing threats and alliances. Cleopatra listened carefully, asking sharp questions. Later, I saw her alone in the garden. She traced patterns in the dirt with a stick, lost in thought. I jumped onto her lap, purring softly. She stroked my fur, but her eyes remained distant. Power had come to her, but the weight of it was already clear. I stayed close, ready to see what would come next. The palace was buzzing with news. Julius Caesar had arrived in Alexandria. His name was spoken in hurried whispers and tense glances. I moved silently through the halls, weaving between feet and skirts, trying to catch every word. When Caesar entered the throne room, the atmosphere changed. His presence was commanding, yet cautious. Cleopatra watched him closely, her eyes sharp and calculating. I jumped onto her shoulder, feeling her heartbeat quicken. The meeting was long and filled with politics. Caesar spoke of Rome's power and the future of Egypt. Cleopatra responded with a steady voice, matching his confidence. I brushed past the marble columns, unnoticed but alert. Later, I prowled the palace gardens, where conversations continued in hushed tones. I overheard plans, alliances, and warnings. The Romans were not just visitors. They were shaping Egypt's destiny. Cleopatra's gaze never left Caesar. I felt her determination deepen. This meeting was the start of something larger than both of them. The palace was quieter now, but the tension was thick like the desert heat outside. I moved silently along the walls, watching Cleopatra meet with her closest advisors. Maps were spread across tables, letters piled high. She spoke with calm authority, her eyes sharp and focused. I rubbed against her feet, sensing the weight of the crown pressing down on her shoulders. The people outside were restless. Whispers of rebellion drifted through the streets. Cleopatra knew she had to show strength, not just to her court, but to all of Egypt. One evening, I watched her address the court. Her voice was steady, commanding respect. The nobles listened closely, some nodding, others whispering behind her back. In the palace kitchens, servants talked nervously. "She is no child anymore," one said. "The queen will not be ignored." I followed Cleopatra as she visited the markets, disguised beneath a cloak. I stayed close, alert to dangers. The people watched her with a mixture of hope and suspicion. She was building her power, step by step, and I was there, watching every move. The palace was filled with Roman voices and the clatter of armor. Envoys arrived bearing messages, gifts, and threats. I moved silently among them, my fur bristling with caution. Cleopatra met with Roman leaders behind closed doors. Their words were careful, but heavy with meaning. I sat nearby, hidden behind a tapestry, catching fragments. Alliance, power, control. The people whispered in the streets. Some hoped for peace, others feared Rome's growing shadow. One evening, Cleopatra walked through the palace gardens with a Roman general. Their conversation was low, serious. I leaped onto a nearby statue and watched their expressions calm but wary. The alliance was fragile, built on promises and risks. Cleopatra knew the stakes were high. Her future and Egypt's depended on it. The palace walls hid many secrets. I prowled through shadowed corridors where hushed voices spoke of jealousy and betrayal. Cleopatra's siblings watched her with wary eyes, waiting for a chance to strike. One evening, I slipped into the dining hall just as a heated argument began. Ptolemy and Arsinoe exchanged sharp words. Cleopatra sat quietly, observing, her fingers twitching. I curled under the table, listening as plans were whispered, plans to undermine her rule, to take power away. But Cleopatra was no longer the child who stayed silent. She met their plots with calm determination, learning whom to trust and whom to watch. In the quiet of night, I found her alone, staring out at the stars. Her mind was heavy with thoughts of family and power. The rivalry was not just personal, it was a battle for Egypt itself. The palace was filled with excitement and quiet whispers. Cleopatra's son had been born. I moved carefully through the chambers, sensing the mixture of joy and tension in the air. The newborn, named Ptolemy Caesar, or Caesarion, as some called him, was small and fragile. Midwives and servants bustled around, preparing soft linens and warm milk. I curled beside the cradle, feeling the tiny breaths of the child. Cleopatra watched him closely, her eyes soft but alert. I saw a new kind of strength in her, the fierce protectiveness of a mother and the steady resolve of a queen. Outside, the people heard the news. Some whispered hope for the future. Others feared what this child might mean for Egypt's fate. In the days that followed, Cleopatra balanced her roles: mother, ruler, and diplomat. I stayed close, a silent companion through every moment. The birth of a son was more than a family event. It was a new chapter in the struggle for power. The palace felt heavy and silent after the news arrived. Julius Caesar was dead. I prowled the dim halls, sensing the shock and fear in every corner. Whispers spread quickly: betrayal, assassination, chaos. Cleopatra sat alone in her chambers, her face unreadable. I curled at her feet, feeling her tension like a storm waiting to break. The courtiers gathered in small groups, voices low but urgent. Some spoke of loyalty, others of survival. I heard rumors of Rome in turmoil, and how this would change everything. Cleopatra's advisors urged caution, but I saw the fire in her eyes. This was not the end, it was a turning point. At night, I watched her look out over the city, her thoughts distant. The future was uncertain, but Cleopatra was ready to face it. Power shifted like the desert sands, and the queen was determined to hold her place. The palace corridors buzzed with news of a new visitor, Mark Antony, one of Rome's most powerful men. I padded silently through the marble halls, curious and alert. When he arrived, the air changed. His presence was strong, confident, yet cautious. I watched as Cleopatra met him in a grand chamber, their eyes locking in a silent conversation. The conversations were long, filled with strategy and power. I nestled near Cleopatra's feet, feeling her tense energy. Antony spoke of Rome, its ambitions, and the delicate balance of power. Servants whispered in corners. Some were hopeful, others wary of the Romans' influence. I darted among the shadows, catching glimpses of smiles, frowns, and guarded words. Cleopatra and Antony began a partnership that would shape the future of Egypt and Rome alike. I stayed close, my eyes and ears open to every secret and plan. The palace was a stage, and every word, glance, and gesture was part of the dance. I watched as Cleopatra and Mark Antony moved carefully among allies and enemies alike. Meetings took place in shadowed chambers, their voices low but sharp. I slipped between the heavy curtains, catching fragments of promises, threats, and strategies. Cleopatra's eyes shone with determination. Antony's expressions shifted, sometimes warm, sometimes guarded. Their alliance was fragile, but powerful. Outside, the people whispered of change. Some hoped for peace, others feared war. I wandered the markets, hearing the mix of excitement and worry. Back inside, I saw servants exchange secret messages, nobles plot, and spies listen. The dance was dangerous. One misstep could mean death, but Cleopatra was learning quickly. She matched each move with grace and strength, and I was there, watching every step. The palace was tense. Soldiers drilled in courtyards, and the sound of armor clinking echoed through the halls. I moved silently among them, my fur bristling with the weight of what was to come. Cleopatra met with generals and advisors, their voices low but urgent. Maps were spread wide, marking enemy positions and battle plans. I curled near her feet, sensing the heavy burden she carried. Mark Antony paced. In the shadows, his face set with determination. Their alliance was no longer just words, it was a promise to defend Egypt at any cost. Outside the palace, whispers of war stirred the people. Merchants hurried, farmers prepared, and children watched with wide eyes. One night, I sat beside Cleopatra. As she looked out over the city lights, her expression steady but serious. She stroked my fur and whispered, "We must be ready." The coming storm was not just for power, it was for survival, and I was there. A silent witness to the queen's courage. The palace was restless. Whispers filled the corridors, messages from the coasts, reports of Roman ships approaching, and orders flying between generals and sailors. I padded silently among the hurried footsteps, my ears catching every hurried word. The great fleet was gathering. Wooden ships creaked as they were pulled from the docks. Sails were unfurled, and oarsmen trained under the scorching sun. I watched from the shadowed walls. Weaving through the legs of captains and soldiers, Cleopatra moved with purpose, her eyes sharp as she met with commanders. She was not just a queen now, but a leader of armies. I rubbed against her robes, sensing her growing determination and anxiety. Mark Antony was there too, his voice firm as he planned the defense of Egypt and its allies. I saw him tracing routes on maps, issuing orders, and calming nervous officers. The people around me, sailors, soldiers, servants, prepared for what would be the largest battle of their lives. I heard their hopes, fears, and whispered prayers. The sky was clear, but the tension hung heavy like a storm waiting to break. I stayed close, knowing that the fate of Egypt was tied to these wooden ships and the men who sailed them. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the harbor. The ships floated silently on the calm water, their sails furled and oars still. I prowled along the docks, my paws careful not to make a sound. Sailors whispered in small groups, some nervous, others resigned. I brushed past a young rower whose hands trembled as he checked his oar. Nearby, an older captain inspected the rigging with steady eyes. Inside the palace, Cleopatra sat quietly, her gaze distant but sharp. I jumped onto her lap, sensing the weight of the coming day pressing down on her. Mark Antony met with his generals, voices low but intense. I slipped into the shadows, hearing talk of tactics, supplies, and the enemy's strength. Outside, the people of Alexandria watched the preparations with mixed feelings, hope, fear, and uncertainty. Merchants closed their stalls early. Children stayed close to their mothers. The night was still, but beneath it, the tension was alive, a quiet storm before the roar. I curled beside Cleopatra as she whispered, "Tomorrow will change everything." The palace corridors were thick with whispered secrets. I slinked silently along the walls, ears twitching for every hidden word. Spies moved like shadows, slipping between rooms and gardens, carrying messages no one else was meant to hear. One night, I followed a cloaked figure through a maze of corridors. She met a man in the dim light, their voices low and urgent. I caught pieces, plans to betray, secret alliances, warnings of the enemy's next move. Cleopatra paced in her chamber, her face tight with worry. I jumped onto her desk, brushing against scattered letters and maps. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read the reports brought by her own spies. Elsewhere, servants whispered of traitors. Some pledged loyalty, others plotted in silence. The palace was a web of trust and betrayal. I watched it all, hidden but attentive, knowing that in this battle, secrets could be the deadliest weapons. Word spread like wildfire. The Roman fleet had been spotted. I was on the eastern wall when the first alarm bell rang. From that height, I saw them, dark dots on the blue sea, growing larger with each hour. Their sails were high, disciplined, their ships moving like a single body across the water. I leaped down into the palace courtyard, where soldiers scrambled into formation. Commands were shouted, armor strapped, and arrows counted. Some men looked calm, others looked pale. In the war chamber, Cleopatra stood before a massive table covered in maps. I curled beneath it as she and Antony stared at the red markers. Rome was closing in. "The fleet is tighter than we thought," one general murmured. "Octavian's men are disciplined. They've done this before." Outside the palace, citizens gathered in hushed groups. I weaved through their legs, hearing prayers, curses, and desperate questions. Mothers clutched children. Merchants boarded windows. I returned to the harbor just in time to see our fleet adjust. Sails unfurled. Oars dipped into the sea. The air smelled of oil, tar, and fear. The Romans were near, and they were ready. Cleopatra did not hide behind palace walls. She stood on the harbor edge, surrounded by captains and commanders, giving orders with clarity and fire. I followed her closely, weaving between armor-plated legs and fluttering sails. She boarded one of the largest ships, her own flagship. Its hull gleamed with polished wood, its crew chosen from Egypt's finest. I sat on a barrel nearby, listening to her voice echo across the deck. She inspected weapons, questioned officers, and even walked below deck where rowers sat, tired but alert. "Your strength moves Egypt forward," she told them. I watched a young man straighten his back at her. Words dot in the city. People watched her every movement. Some climbed onto rooftops to catch a glimpse of their queen beside warships. A woman whispered, "She sails with us. She does not hide." At night, she returned to the palace only briefly. I found her sitting beside a burning oil lamp, reviewing scrolls, while commanders argued nearby. She didn't flinch. She made decisions. Cleopatra was not just present, she was central. A queen, a general, and too many hope. I curled beneath her chair, knowing that where she led, Egypt would follow. Mark Antony never slept, for days. He moved between war tents and palace chambers, poring over maps, adjusting markers, and sending out messengers with rolled orders tucked beneath their arms. I followed him closely, often hiding under tables, beside chests, or in the folds of thick curtains. At night, he stood over the Great War map in the planning room. He didn't speak much. He stared, hands behind his back, jaw clenched. "Generals," whispered options. "Strike from the east. Break their lines with fire ships. Lure them into the strait." He listened, nodded slowly, then made decisions that silenced the room. I slipped out once to the training yards. There, soldiers trained in silence. The air was dry and thick with sweat and iron. I climbed onto the shoulder of a bronze statue to watch. One captain barked orders, his voice cracking with urgency. Antony walked among them too. Not in armor, but in thought. I saw him place a hand on a soldier's shoulder, then move on. He wasn't just giving orders, he was holding the burden. Cleopatra joined him that evening in the map room. They didn't speak much, just exchanged looks. That said enough. I curled on a windowsill, gazing at the quiet fleet below. The plan was set. The weight of it pressed on all of us. War was coming, and Antony was steering its course. At dawn, the silence broke. I was on the deck of Cleopatra's flagship when the first Roman trumpet echoed across the sea. A sharp, metallic cry that sent flocks of birds flying from the cliffs. The horizon moved. Rome's ships advanced, row after row. Like a metal wall across the water, our men rushed to their positions. I weaved between boots and dropped ropes, ducking under benches as oars struck the sea in rhythm. The first sound of impact came with a crunch of wood and a man's scream. A Roman ram tore into one of our side ships. Arrows flew in every direction. I crouched beneath the shield rack, ears flat, tail still. Cleopatra was calm. She stood beside her captain, shouting instructions clearly. She didn't flinch when a fire arrow struck the mast of a nearby ship. Her crew scrambled. I saw fear in their eyes, but not in hers. Antony's ships held the western flank. I later heard, through the panicked voices of a returning scout, that he had pushed back a wave of attackers, using a feint maneuver, pulling the enemy forward, then crushing them with reinforcements from behind. I crept across narrow gangplanks, connecting ships, nearly slipping once as a Roman javelin clanged nearby. The sea beneath me churned red. Soldiers died with curses on their lips. Others shouted to the gods. The noise was thunder, men, wind, wood, fire. By midday, the decks were soaked with seawater, sweat, and blood. Cleopatra still stood, shouting, over the chaos, holding the line. I hid near a coil of rope, heart pounding. I had never seen war like this, and it was only the beginning. Smoke stung my eyes. I leaped over a broken plank as flames licked the side of the deck. Roman fire ships had reached our eastern line. I didn't have time to hide. Dashed beneath the legs of a sailor just as he screamed, clutching an arrow buried in his chest. Blood sprayed across my fur. The air was thick with shouts and the smell of burning pitch. I darted onto the next ship, my paws slipping on the blood-slicked wood. A Roman grappling hook clanged as it landed beside me, biting into the deck. I hissed and sprang back, narrowly avoiding it. I climbed the rigging, using the ropes like tree branches, my claws catching just enough for grip. From above, I saw everything. Antony's western flank was being pushed back. Roman ships had broken through the center, and then I saw Cleopatra's flagship begin to turn. It wasn't retreat yet, but it wasn't forward either. I scrambled down the sail just as a fire arrow hit a barrel near the mast. The explosion knocked me off balance. I landed hard on the deck beside two dead oarsmen. I limped, one paw aching, but kept moving. Below deck, rowers shouted in panic. Water poured in from a breach. I ran along the low beams, dodging splinters and smoke, then squeezed through a vent and burst into the daylight again. Above, Cleopatra was shouting something. I couldn't hear it over the wind and screams. I jumped onto the shoulder of a fallen sailor and then up the steps of the command platform. There, I climbed onto the rail and stared at her face. She saw the breach too. The line was failing. She turned to her captain, signaled the retreat. Her voice was sharp. Final. I froze. I felt it in my bones. The battle had shifted. The enemy had pressed us too far. The ships began to turn. I almost fell again as the deck swayed beneath me. Around us, some of our ships burned. Others sank. Romans cheered. We rowed dot. And in that chaotic fire-lit sea, I realized something terrifying. This was no longer a battle for victory. It was now a flight for survival. They say cats always land on their feet, but when Cleopatra's flagship lurched hard to the left, even I struggled to stay upright. The sea was alive with screams. Roman ships closed in behind us, their sails tight in the wind. I clung to a fraying rope on the upper deck, claws digging in as the ship groaned and twisted beneath my paws. Faster, the helmsman cried. Row, row. I stumbled toward the command platform where Cleopatra stood. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, her lips drawn into a cold line. She didn't blink as fire lit the sky behind us. A Roman projectile slammed into the rear of a trailing vessel, one of our own. It split in two, like rotted wood. Men tumbled into the sea, their cries fading into the wind. I watched one man reach for a floating plank hand, then vanish beneath a churning wave. Cleopatra turned her face, just slightly, not weakness, acknowledgement. I darted under her robe as another blast rocked the ship. She didn't flinch. I felt her legs stiffen. She was terrified, but she would never let them see it. Below deck, I squeezed through crates of food, supplies, and weapons. The rowers bled from their hands. One coughed blood. Another collapsed. Yet, they kept pulling, even as the ship's frame creaked like it would rip apart. I leapt onto a barrel and clawed at a sliding crate that threatened to crush a fallen boy. It rolled past me instead, slamming into the wall. I hissed at it, heart pounding dot above. A lookout shouted, "They're falling back." The Romans slow, not for long. We were not sailing to regroup. We were fleeing. I saw it in Cleopatra's eyes when I climbed to her shoulder and curled there, wet, burned, and shaking. We weren't leaving to win another day. We were leaving because we were defeated. There was no victory song, no cheers, just silence as the last of our ships drifted into open waters. I lay curled beside Cleopatra on the deck, our fur and robes both soaked with salt, smoke, and something heavier dashed defeat. No one spoke. The sails hung loose, and the oars moved only, with tired groans. Soldiers sat where they had stood, staring at nothing. One man gently touched the blood-stained edge of his armor, as if wondering whose it was. Cleopatra hadn't moved in hours. Her fingers clutched the edge of the railing. I climbed into her lap and felt her heart beating steady, but slower than before. She whispered something in Egyptian. I didn't understand it, but I knew it wasn't for anyone else to hear. Mark Antony was below deck. He hadn't emerged since the retreat began. Some said he broke a table in rage. Others said he just sat, staring at his sword. I ventured down once. He didn't even glance at me as I stepped quietly over his boot and settled near the barrel in the corner. He was still breathing, but something inside him had gone quiet. The sea rocked gently now, too gently. I walked the length of the ship in the dark, passing curled sailors, flickering lanterns, and the sound of men crying into their cloaks. Even the youngest among them understood. They had sailed to win a war, and now they were just survivors. By morning, Alexandria's coast would return to view, but we would not return the same. I licked the dried blood from my paw and stared at the stars above. They were the same as the night before the battle, unchanging. But everything else was different now. The sails were down. The flags hung limp in the dead wind. I sat on a stone pillar near the harbor, my tail curled tightly around my paws, listening. Alexandria's port once filled with shouting dock workers, merchants, and music was quiet now. Too quiet. Not a single oar dipped into the water. The sea itself seemed to hold its breath. The soldiers who returned from Actium did not raise their heads. They limped off the ships in silence, dragging bloodied armor, broken spears, and haunted eyes. I followed a group of them down the wharf, weaving between their legs, sniffing at the drying blood on their boots. Mark Antony was the last to leave his vessel. He didn't speak. 2 guards helped him down the plank. I leaped onto a nearby crate and watched as he stared blankly ahead. He walked like his bones carried more weight than his body. Cleopatra came later. She descended from her ship slowly, wrapped in dark silk. Her crown was gone. Her eyes scanned the port not for people, but for signs, for omens. She saw none. I padded behind her into the city, past the temple columns and silent vendors. The streets were lined with people who didn't speak. No one waved. No one cried out. The queen passed them, and they bowed not out of love, but fear. Up on the rooftops, pigeons cooed nervously. Even they felt that something was coming. I jumped onto a windowsill and looked back at the harbor. The water barely moved. The ships were docked, but they didn't look like they had returned home. They looked like they were waiting for the end. It started with footsteps, not loud, rhythmic, measured, controlled, like a drumbeat far away. I was lying beneath a merchant's cart when I felt the stone street tremble. I raised my head. The humans didn't notice yet, but I did. My ears twitched. Something heavy was marching toward us. I darted up a staircase to a rooftop and stared north. Dust. A long line of it slowly crawling toward the city. Then glints of sunlight off armor. Helmets, shields, rows of Roman soldiers. I dropped back, down into the street, and ran dot in the marketplace. Vendors were already packing up. Bread left unsold. Dates left scattered. One woman pulled her child inside a linen stall, whispering for him not to speak. I ran past their feet, through spilled olives and overturned baskets. When I reached the palace gates, I leaped onto a column and watched the guards. They weren't talking. One gripped his spear so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Inside the palace, servants moved like ghosts. I passed through the kitchen, where no fire burned. Bread sat half-kneaded. A young boy stared at the floor, unmoving, a knife in his hand meant for herbs, not war. I entered Cleopatra's hall, just as a runner arrived muddy, breathless. He dropped to one knee. "They'll be at the gates before nightfall," he said. I climbed onto the windowsill and looked again. The Romans were getting closer. I could see the red of their cloaks now. Cleopatra didn't blink. "Lock the gates," she said, but she knew, and I knew. Wooden gates could not hold back an empire. I was sleeping on a stack of scrolls in the west wing when I heard the first crack like a tree splitting in a storm. I leaped up, claws sinking into the papyrus ears. High, another crack, then a scream. I dashed through the hallway, tail stiff, fur raised. A servant girl flew past me, barefoot, sobbing. "They've breached the outer gate." I slipped under a brass incense stand, just as the third crack exploded through the palace. The wooden gate had shattered, and then they poured in. Roman boots slammed against marble. I crouched beneath a table as their formation fanned out, disciplined, silent, like hounds unleashed in a holy place. One knocked over a vase, another stepped and spilled oil and didn't stop. A spearhead clattered beside me. I darted between armored legs, claws scratching against the stone. A fallen tray skidded across the floor and nearly crushed my tail. The main hallway was chaos. Cleopatra's guards fought desperately, but the Romans moved like machine-strained. Relentless. I saw one guard stabbed through the stomach. He dropped to his knees, and then to his side. I jumped over his arm as he exhaled his last breath. Cleopatra's voice rang out from the throne room. "Do not let them pass." But even her tone trembled this time. I ran into her chamber through a side passage and jumped onto the high shelf above the doorway. From there, I watched. Her golden throne sat empty. She stood, instead-ridged, jaws set, fists clenched. The doors shook with each strike from outside. They would not hold much longer. When the final hinges gave way, I felt the floor jolt. The Romans entered, not charging Stepan, like they had already won. I didn't run. I pressed myself against the stone and watched the world shift forever. The air grew thick with smoke. It wasn't the palace this time, it was farther, to the east, where the great library stood. I raced through narrow alleys, paws pounding on cracked stone. The scent of burning papyrus and melted wax filled my nostrils. My eyes watered, but I didn't stop. Flames licked the walls of the massive building, swallowing rows of scrolls and books older than any living soul. I saw men dousing torches into oil barrels, eyes wild with fear and anger. Some tried to save what they could, but the fire moved faster than hands. A priest shouted curses at the Romans, then turned to bury sacred texts in the dirt. I watched him dig with trembling hands, tossing fragile scrolls into a shallow pit, closer to the blaze. A pile of manuscripts ignited suddenly, sending sparks into the sky like tiny stars falling. I darted beneath a fallen beam as it crashed down. The ground shook beneath me. People screamed. Some ran blindly, knocking over carts and each other. A woman's shawl caught fire. I leaped forward, clawing at it, but she pulled away, terrified. The library was dying. I scrambled up a scorched pillar, watching the flames consume knowledge built over centuries. And as I looked down at the burning scrolls, I understood that with this fire, a piece of the world's memory was vanishing forever. Smoke choked the streets. Flames crackled from broken windows, sending sparks into the darkening sky. I darted through the alleys, paws skimming over broken pottery and scattered goods. People ran in every direction, mothers clutching children, merchants dragging bundles, soldiers shouting orders that no one followed. A cart overturned nearby. I leaped just in time as it crashed into a stone wall, shattering. The smell of burning wood mixed with sweat and fear. I slipped past a group of soldiers, arguing fiercely, their faces grim and voices low. One spat on the ground and cursed loudly. In the chaos, I found a small boy crying behind a wall. His clothes were torn, and his eyes wide with terror. I rubbed against his leg, and for a moment, he smiled a fragile hope in a city crumbling dot. Suddenly, a distant explosion shook the ground. People screamed and scattered. I scrambled up a pile of rubble to see the city burning from above, fires consuming homes, temples, and shops. I raced down into the market square where voices rose in anger. Some called for rebellion, others begged for mercy. I darted through their legs, feeling the raw pulse of a city fighting to survive. In that moment, I wasn't just a witness. I was part of Alexandria's desperate heartbeat. The temple was cold and dark, a stark contrast to the burning city above. I slipped through the heavy wooden doors and into the quiet stone halls. The scent of incense mixed with dust and sweat hung thick in the air. I moved silently among the figures huddled in shadow priests, scribes, and farmers who had fled the streets. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices barely more than whispers. One old priest held a cracked bowl, murmuring prayers to the gods. His fingers trembled as he traced symbols into the dust. A young woman sat beside him, her eyes red from tears. She clutched a small bundle, a child, sleeping despite the chaos. The farmers spoke of crops lost, of hunger coming with the invaders. Their voices trembled with fear and exhaustion. I curled up near the warmth of a dying fire, feeling the weight of their despair. I rubbed against the old priest's leg, and he reached down to stroke my fur, his fingers gentle despite the fear in his eyes. Suddenly, distant shouts echoed through the temple halls. The group tensed, holding their breath, but the voices faded. For a moment, there was silence. In that silence, I felt the fragile hope they tried to hold on to, faith in gods, in queens, in a future that seemed farther away than ever. The palace was quieter than before, but the air felt heavy, thick with whispers and worry. I padded softly through the marble halls, my paws barely making a sound on the polished floor. Servants hurried past, their faces pale and eyes darting. Cleopatra stood in the grand hall, her fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the armrest of her throne. Her gaze kept flickering toward the door that led to the children's chambers. "Where is Caesarion?" Her voice was low, but sharp. A guard approached, sweating. "He's nowhere to be found, my queen. We've searched every room." I slipped into the children's quarters, weaving between overturned toys and scattered cushions. The bed was empty, sheets rumpled, as if someone had left in a hurry. I sniffed the air. A faint scent of lavender lingered, mixed with the unmistakable sharpness of fear. Down the corridor, voices rose, Cleopatra's ladies-in-waiting, arguing quietly, blaming each other. I jumped onto a windowsill, watching the anxious faces below. One servant whispered, "The Romans could be coming for him. He is the last hope." Another replied, "We must hide him, or all is lost." I darted between shadows, sensing the urgency and dread. I brushed against Cleopatra's hand as she paced. Her fingers trembled, but her face was steady. Sis was missing, and in that missing boy lay the fragile future of a kingdom. The air was thick with tension. I'd found Mark Antony in the war room, surrounded by maps and scattered scrolls. He was seated, his armor loosened, but his eyes burned with a fierce determination. As I stepped closer, his hand reached out without looking. I jumped onto the table, curling near a parchment with the city's defenses drawn in ink. His voice was low, but each word carried weight. "We make our last stand here. The city's fate depends on this night." Soldiers filed in and out, nodding silently. Some carried weapons, others carried news of the approaching Roman legions. I brushed against Antony's hand again. He paused, then gripped my fur gently. Outside, distant drums beat in ominous rhythm. I followed Antony as he moved to the balcony overlooking the city. Below, lanterns flickered in the gathering darkness, casting long shadows. He turned to his commanders, voice steady but filled with sadness. "Hold the walls. Protect the people. If we fall together." I leaped onto the railing beside him, feeling the weight of his resolve. The night stretched long and cold. Men sharpened swords, whispered prayers, and prepared for battle. Antony's last stand was not just a fight for land, it was a fight for a legacy. And I was there, watching it all unfold beneath the stars. The morning was still, too still. I padded quietly across the palace courtyard, ears alert. Soldiers in Roman armor moved with a calm that felt unnatural. Their footsteps echoed off the marble walls. High above, on the tallest tower, I saw it, a crimson flag with the golden eagle fluttering in the gentle breeze. I climbed swiftly up the stone steps, my claws scraping softly against the worn surface. When I reached the battlements, I perched on the cold ledge and watched. The flag waved proudly, signaling the new rulers. Below, palace servants and guards moved silently, their faces shadowed with resignation. The queen was nowhere in sight. The city streets felt empty, the usual noise replaced by a heavy hush. I slipped into a quiet alley, weaving between broken carts and fallen banners. The marketplace was deserted. A few scared faces peeked from behind closed shutters. I heard whispers, words like lost, conquered, and change. I curled up beneath an olive tree and licked my paw. The city had changed overnight. The flag was no longer just cloth, it was a symbol of a lost kingdom. The streets were empty, but not silent. I padded slowly through the ruins, cracked stones, shattered columns, and fallen statues. The air smelled of dust and ash. Here and there, I found survivors. A woman crouched beside a broken cart, clutching a tattered shawl. A child huddled near a burned-down home, eyes wide and unblinking. I brushed past a group of men gathered quietly in a corner. Their faces were drawn tight with grief and exhaustion. They spoke little, their voices rough and low. The city had lost its voice. I climbed atop a fallen pillar and looked out over the shattered skyline. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over what once was a place of light and learning. I curled into a ball, feeling the weight of history pressing down. Alexandria was no longer the city I had known. It was a memory, and memories, no matter how bright, could never hold back the future. The weight of silence filled the room. I perched on the edge of the throne room, tail flicking softly as I watched Mark Antony sit alone. His armor removed but his shoulders heavy. His eyes stared blankly at the floor, once fierce and commanding, now tired and distant. I leaped quietly onto his knee, sensing his unrest. His hand, rough and calloused, cupped my head gently, but did not speak. Outside, the city whispered rumors of defeat. Inside, Antony's breath was shallow. I moved closer as he ran a hand through his tangled hair, voice barely a whisper. "We have lost more than a battle." The room felt colder. I pressed against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart slow and uneven. He stood abruptly, pacing the chamber. I chased after him, weaving between his legs. He stopped at the window, looking out over Alexandria. The city was quiet. Too quiet. I nuzzled his side. He sighed deeply, as if the weight of an empire rested on him. I could feel it too. This was not just defeat. It was the end of a dream. The heavy velvet curtains muffled voices, but I crept closer, ears twitching. Mark Antony sat opposite Cleopatra in a dimly lit chamber. Their faces were shadows of worry and exhaustion. I slipped beneath the table, watching their lips move in hushed tones, though I could not understand the words. The tension was clear. Cleopatra's fingers nervously traced patterns on the armrest. Antony's jaw was clenched tight, his eyes locked on hers. They spoke of alliances lost, and battles won and lost, of survival and impossible choices. Suddenly, Antony's hand reached down and rested lightly on Cleopatra's wrist. I nudged into his palm. He looked down, eyes softening for a moment. The room felt colder with their fears, but in that touch was a fragile bond hope in a time of despair. I curled up between them on the floor, listening as their whispered plans wove through the silence. Outside, the palace walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would come next. The great hall buzzed with quiet urgency. I weaved through the legs of soldiers gathered around. Mark Antony. His voice was low, but firm, each word measured. "Hold your ground. Protect the city at all costs," he commanded. I brushed past a young soldier whose hands trembled as he adjusted his helmet. Antony placed a steady hand on his shoulder, silent reassurance. I climbed onto the edge of the table, watching Antony's face as he moved among his men, nodding and offering brief words. His eyes were tired but burning with resolve. After the orders were given, Antony stepped outside onto the balcony. I followed silently, settling at his feet. He looked out over Alexandria's walls, his jaw tight. "Tonight, we fight for our lives and for history," he said. I pressed my fur against his boots, feeling the weight of his determination. The soldiers below prepared their weapons, the clinking of armor filling the air. And I knew this night would be the last stand. The air shifted. I was perched atop the palace wall when the first sounds came, a distant thunder of marching feet. At first, I thought it was a storm approaching, but the ground trembled beneath me. I twitched my whiskers, alert. From the city gates, a column of soldiers appeared, droves of glinting armor and banners waving in the sun. Roman soldiers. Their presence was heavy, Like a shadow stretching over Alexandria, I slipped through corridors. As servants hurried to close windows and barricade doors, the streets buzzed with whispers and hurried footsteps. People peered from behind cracked shutters, faces pale. I moved closer to the courtyard where Antony stood with his commanders. His expression was grim but determined. Caesar's forces were here. I crouched low, watching the slow approach of the men who would decide the city's fate. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows. The city held its breath. The chamber was dimly lit, heavy with unspoken words. I slipped quietly inside as Mark Antony entered, followed closely by Cleopatra. Their eyes met, briefly tired, searching. I wound between their feet, brushing softly against their ankles, sensing the weight pressing on them. Cleopatra's hand found Antony's fingers tightening with a silent plea. He knelt and rested his forehead against her palm. His breath was shallow, but steady. They spoke in hushed tones, plans for escape, fears of the future, regrets unspoken. I jumped onto the windowsill and looked out over the city, the same city that held their hopes and sorrows. Their last meeting was not filled with grand words, but with quiet strength. I settled beside them, sharing the fragile moment as the walls around us seemed to close in. The air was thick with dust and tension. I found Mark Antony collapsed in a dim corner of the palace, blood staining his tunic and pooling quietly beneath him. He was breathing hard, each inhale a struggle. I jumped onto his lap, pressing close to offer warmth. His fingers trembled as they stroked my fur. I could feel the pain radiating from his body. Around us, servants moved quickly, some with cloth to bind wounds, others whispering prayers. Antony's eyes fluttered open, meeting mine briefly. "Stay close," he whispered, voice weak but filled with unyielding spirit. I curled beside him, feeling the slow ebb of his strength. Outside, distant sounds of battle echoed, but here, in this small, shadowed space, it was just him, me, in the heavy silence of fading hope. The corridors were silent, except for the soft patter of my paws. Antony paced anxiously, clutching a folded parchment. He looked to me, his eyes heavy but resolute. He carefully tied the message to my collar. Final hope. I slipped through shadowed halls and winding staircases, dodging guards and servants alike. The air smelled of incense and fear. I reached Cleopatra's chamber door, slipping inside unnoticed. She sat by the window, her gaze distant and weary. I rubbed against her ankle, and she looked down, surprised to see me. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted the parchment. She untied it, her hands trembling slightly as she read. I felt the weight of Antony's words settle over us both. This message was more than paper, it was a desperate plea, a warning, a final connection. I stayed close as Cleopatra folded the letter, her jaw set firm. The fate of two souls and an empire now rested in those words. The room was dim, shadows stretching long across the walls. I curled beside Mark Antony's chest, feeling the slow, weakening beat of his heart beneath my fur. His breathing grew shallow, each gasp softer than the last. His fingers found mine, gripping tightly a final farewell. Around us, the palace was quiet, save for distant murmurs and the crackle of dying fires. I nuzzled his cheek as his eyes fluttered closed, a faint sigh escaping his lips. The weight of loss filled the air, thick and heavy. As his spirit slipped away, I stayed, a silent witness, to the end of a warrior, The world outside continued, but here, time seemed to pause. The palace was heavy with sorrow. I wandered through the dim corridors, my paws silent on the stone floors. Mourners filled the great hall, soldiers with bowed heads, servants wiping tears, and nobles whispering prayers. Candles flickered, casting trembling shadows on the walls. I brushed past a group of women, their faces streaked with tears and makeup smudged from grief. Cleopatra sat alone on a low bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I curled beside her, sensing the heaviness in the air. The sounds of lamentations rose and fell like waves, echoing through the halls. I watched as the queen's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her lips pressed into a firm line. Antony was gone, and the palace, once full of life, felt hollow. The city moved slowly, shadows of the past lingering in every corner. I wandered through the empty halls of the palace, touching the cold stone where Antony once stood. Servants spoke in hushed tones, recalling his strength and failures. Children whispered his name with curiosity, unaware of the man behind the legend. In the marketplace, traders told stories of battles fought and lost, of courage and sacrifice. I sat atop a sun-warmed wall, watching the sunset paint the sky in deep reds, a color that reminded me of his armor. Though gone, his presence echoed in the stones, the air, and the hearts of those left behind. And I, a silent witness, kept his memory alive with every quiet step I took. The palace air was heavy, thick with the scent of incense and unspoken fears. I prowled silently through the grand halls, slipping past guards and servants who moved with quiet urgency. Cleopatra's footsteps echoed softly as she walked through the rooms. She once ruled with confidence. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with worry. She often sat by the window, staring out at the city once vibrant, now tense and uncertain. I rubbed against her legs, sensing her restless heart. The walls whispered secrets of approaching doom. Outside, distant drums beat steadily, the march of Roman forces drawing nearer. Within the palace, the queen prepared not just for war, but for the end of an era. I stayed close, a silent shadow, watching as the final days unfolded. The palace buzzed with nervous whispers. I slipped between hurried feet and rustling robes, catching fragments of conversations, words like Rome, siege, and no escape. Servants peeked anxiously from behind heavy curtains, while guards exchanged grim looks. Cleopatra paced the chamber, her fingers clutching a delicate scroll. She spoke little, but the tension radiated from her like heat. I perched on a carved chair beside her, curling into a tight ball as the distant sound of marching drums grew louder. The walls seemed to close in, shadows stretching longer with every passing hour. Rome's presence was no longer a threat in the distance. It was here, and with it came the weight of inevitability. The evening was quiet but heavy. I curled beside Cleopatra as she sat alone in a small, dimly lit chamber. Her hands trembled as she handled a small basket, carefully hidden beneath a silk cloth dot inside. The soft rustle of leaves and the faint hiss of something alive. She looked at me with tired eyes, no longer the queen of confident smiles, but a woman burdened by impossible choices. I brushed against her hand, sensing the finality in the air. She whispered words I could not understand, but the sorrow in her voice was clear. The serpent had arrived, the symbol of death and freedom. In that moment, I understood. The end was near. The chamber was small and dim, lit only by a single flickering candle. I settled on the cold stone floor beside Cleopatra as she sat silently, her gaze distant. The faint scent of myrrh and sandalwood filled the air. Her breathing was slow, almost rhythmic, but beneath it lay a restless tension. The basket rested nearby, covered and still. She reached out, gently stroking my fur, seeking comfort. Time seemed to slow as the quiet stretched, broken only by the occasional soft hiss from the basket. I could feel the weight of the moment, the crossing, from life to what comes after. The queen's final solitude. The chamber was cloaked in a quiet darkness, broken only by the soft glow of a dying candle. I lay curled beside Cleopatra, her presence both fragile and commanding. Her breathing was shallow but steady, each rise and fall of her chest a gentle rhythm in the stillness. Her hand trembled as it reached down, fingertips brushing against my fur with a softness I had never felt before. She looked down at me, her eyes heavy but clear, holding a mixture of sorrow, strength, and something like farewell. I pressed my head against her palm, feeling the warmth and the weight of unspoken words. The serpent's basket sat close by, silent except for the faint hiss that whispered through the cloth. Cleopatra's gaze shifted to the basket, then back to me. She whispered a name soft, almost a breath, and in that moment, I felt the finality settle like a shadow over the room. She stroked my fur slowly, as if memorizing every strand, every curve. The silence wrapped around us, thick and unyielding. Outside, distant sounds of the palace faded into nothingness. Inside, time seemed to slow, stretching each second into eternity. I could feel the tension in her body slowly ebbing. The last flicker of life that clung stubbornly. Her fingers curled around, mine briefly, silent promise, a goodbye. I stayed close as her eyes grew heavy, lids fluttering shut with a softness that broke my heart. The world outside no longer mattered. It was just her, me, and the stillness of a final goodbye. The first light of dawn seeped through heavy drapes as I wandered the quiet halls. A sudden stir broke the silence, a sharp gasp from a servant outside Cleopatra's chamber. I padded swiftly toward the source, sensing the sudden tension in the air. The heavy door creaked open, and faces flooded in nobles, guards, and attendants, their expressions shifting from hope to dread. Whispers spread quickly. The queen, she's gone. I slipped between the crowd, eyes wide, heart pounding in my small chest. They gathered around the chamber, touching her still form with trembling hands. Some wept openly, others stood frozen, disbelief etched deep in their faces. The scent of incense mingled with the cold air, a strange mixture of reverence and sorrow. I brushed past a noblewoman clutching a faded scarf, her tears falling silently. The palace felt emptier somehow, the loss heavy and absolute, and I, a silent witness, could only watch as the queen's life slipped quietly away from the world. The palace was draped in black. I wandered among clusters of mourners, their faces heavy with grief. Soldiers lowered banners, servants wept quietly, and nobles spoke in hushed tones. The air was thick with the scent of burning myrrh and whispered prayers. I brushed past Cleopatra's attendants, their hands trembling as they arranged flowers around her portrait. In the courtyard, the people gathered, farmers, traders, and children, each carrying their own sorrow. I slipped through the crowd, sensing the weight of loss in their eyes. Stories of the queen's strength and struggles spread from lips to lips, though her reign had ended. Her presence lingered etched into the very stones of Alexandria. I settled atop a sun-warmed wall, watching as the city mourned a queen who had become legend. The banners of Rome replaced the royal standards. I slipped silently through halls once ruled by Cleopatra, now echoing with unfamiliar voices and orders. Roman soldiers patrolled the streets, their armor clinking against the stone. Servants who once served the queen whispered nervously, their eyes scanning for signs of change. The palace was transformed, not just in appearance but in spirit. Old customs faded as Roman laws took hold. I watched as governors and commanders took seats on thrones once reserved for Egyptian royalty. The city's heartbeat changed faster, stranger, less familiar. Yet, amid the new order, the memory of Cleopatra remained a flicker beneath the surface, a story whispered in quiet corners. I padded through markets and alleys, sensing the mixed emotions of the people: fear, hope, and reluctant acceptance. Rome had claimed Egypt, but the soul of the land still lingered. The city was quieter than ever, but I was everywhere, slipping through narrow alleys, darting across busy squares, and slipping past Roman guards with nimble paws. I raced through the docks, weaving between wooden crates and barrels, leaping onto ships as they unloaded. The smell of salt and fish filled the air. I slipped below deck on a large Roman warship, narrowly avoiding a soldier's boot, my fur brushing against splintered wood. Blood stained the planks from wounded men resting on stretchers. I leaped onto a crate, shaking off droplets of dark red that splattered my fur from the ship. I sprinted into the streets where soldiers marched, their armor clanking loudly. I dodged between their legs, weaving through tight formations, occasionally brushing against a commanding officer's cloak as he bent over a map spread on a wooden table. Without warning, I jumped onto the table, scattering papers and maps, startling everyone. The commanders shouted, but I was already slipping away, my tail flicking defiantly. Back in the palace, I scrambled up the richly embroidered gowns of servants, preparing for a Roman feast, earning startled gasps. Cleopatra's rooms felt empty now, but I explored every corner: soft cushions, heavy curtains, and the faint scent of jasmine. Despite the silence, the city lived on in chaos and change, and I was in the middle of it, Alan, unseen. Quick shadow with sharp eyes and curious paws. Though the city grew quiet, her story roared on. I prowled through bustling markets where storytellers wove tales of a queen unlike any other. Children chased me playfully, asking questions their parents whispered about questions about a woman who ruled with cunning and courage. In dusty libraries, I slipped between ancient scrolls and parchments, the faded ink whispering secrets of her life. I sat beside poets and historians who debated her legacy. Was she a ruler, a lover, or a symbol? At night, I climbed the highest tower, gazing out over a city that still bore her mark: the stones, the walls, the very air charged with memory. Her name echoed in whispers and songs, and though she was gone, I carried her story in my footsteps, keeping her spirit alive in every silent step. The banners of the Ptolemies were gone. I watched as Roman eagles replaced them, fluttering high above Alexandria's gates. I leaped from balcony to balcony, following the first Roman governor's procession into the palace. The marble halls echoed with unfamiliar Latin orders, and scribes scurried like ants, carrying scrolls stamped with new seals. I crept into the council chamber, hiding beneath a bronze brazier, as maps of Egypt were unrolled and divided by gloved Roman hands. coins with Cleopatra's face were melted and replaced with the emperor's. I pawed at one, still warm from the forge, before slipping away through the servant tunnels. In the streets, farmers stood in silence, unsure whether to bow or to run. Roman taxmen walked with scribes and armed guards. I followed them, leaping onto carts to see them counting wheat and oil jars. One man cried out when his last goat was taken. I crouched beside his empty basket, watching the weight of empire fall on small shoulders. The queen was gone, and Rome ruled with parchment and sword. Alexandria no longer woke to the sound of temple drums. Now it was the tramp of Roman boots that echoed at sunrise. I prowled the rooftops, watching bread lines stretch longer by the day. Fishermen grumbled in corners, their nets taxed before their catch even hit the sand. I slipped into a bakery where a boy once fed me scraps. During Cleopatra's reign, now he gave me nothing. His tray was bare, and his mother wept silently behind the oven. In the forum, statues of Greek gods were replaced by Roman busts. I clawed at one of the new plinths, its white marble smooth but cold. Tax collectors shouted at merchants. I ducked under market stalls to escape stomping sandals. A girl selling figs dropped one, and I snatched it, only to be kicked by a soldier who called me a cursed omen. I hissed, but not out of pain, out of confusion. Where had the music gone? Where were the storytellers? The Nile still flowed, and the sun still rose, but something essential had been silenced. The people walked with heads lowered. Now, and I once Cleopatra's shadow, was just another creature beneath the weight of Rome. I knew every scent in the palace linen soaked in lavender, the ink on royal decrees, and the faint perfume of queens. But now, those scents had vanished. I searched room after room where the Ptolemies once ruled, empty thrones, locked chambers, and storage rooms filled with broken statues. I climbed onto a shelf in the old library, knocking over a scroll that bore Cleopatra's seal. It crumbled in the dust. No one came to collect it. I chased echoes through long corridors where I once saw princes race and servants laugh. Now only Roman footsteps disturbed the silence. The rooms of Cleopatra's children had been stripped bare. I scratched at a carved door, but it wouldn't open. Only dust answered me. One evening, I crept into the royal crypt beneath the palace. I squeezed through a crack in the stone, my paws touching soft sand and cool marble. Names once spoken with reverence now lay in shadow. Ptolemy Arsinoe, Bernice. I curled beside a sealed tomb, remembering voices that would never return. Outside, the world moved on, but beneath the earth, I remained a little longer, guarding what little remained of a dynasty. The palace was not silent that day, yet held its breath. I waited atop the stone arch above the main gate, tail flicking nervously as the sound of Roman hooves filled the courtyard. Cleopatra's children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus were brought out. Surrounded by guards, Caesarion looked older than I remembered, taller, quieter, with his mother's eyes, but none of her power now. He glanced at the walls. One last time, I dropped down from the arch and followed, weaving between the boots of soldiers and the dusty hems of CLOAKS. In the throne room, Roman envoys read out scrolls. The younger children didn't understand the Latin words, but they saw the fear in the servants' faces. I sat beneath the throne, watching as Alexander Helios clutched a carved toy lion I'd seen Cleopatra give him when the Romans led them out. I dashed between their feet, following to the edge of the gates. Caesarion was taken separately. They said he was a threat. I never saw him again. The others were led to the harbor, toward ships bound for Rome. I leaped onto a stack of crates, watching as they disappeared into the holes. My green eyes locked on their faces as the doors shut. Wind tugged at my fur. Salt filled my nose. And just like that, the last of Cleopatra's bloodline was carried away by the empire she once defied. Alexandria no longer smelled like it used to. The sweet spice of Egyptian incense had faded, replaced by olive oil and iron. I ran along the rooftops, my claws scraping Roman tile instead of Egyptian clay. The library stood, but it felt different. Guards posted at the entrance now wore Roman crests, and scholars spoke Latin more than Greek. I slipped through a broken window and darted across a marble floor where scrolls once covered every inch. Now, crates with Roman stamps sat in their place in the great square. Statues of Isis and Horus were removed. I watched workers pull them down with ropes, dust rising as stone cracked against the ground. In their place, bronze statues of Roman emperors rose, polished and proud. I circled a new one, Augustus's eyes staring toward the sea. Vendors had changed too. Greek merchants were fewer. Roman traders barked in sharp voices and paid with new coins. I weaved through carts of wine and glass, noting how fewer locals spoke to one another. The soul of Alexandria, the songs, the debates, the gossip had dulled. One afternoon, I followed a procession of Roman senators into a new marble building. I leaped through an open window and landed directly on a map of Egypt stretched across a table. The men laughed, thinking me a stray, but I stood there, tail raised, paws planted on what used to be Cleopatra's capital. To them, I was nothing. To me, it was still home, though it looked less like it every day. They said she was a goddess now. Not everyone. Of course, the Romans scoffed, but in the narrow alleys and behind shuttered windows, people still whispered her name with reverence. I crept into a small home near the old harbor, where a woman lit a lamp beside a clay figure. It was shaped like Cleopatra, delicate nose, braided hair, a cobra on her brow. I curled in a corner and listened as the woman prayed, not to Isis or any Roman god, but to the queen who had died with her pride intact. She watches us, the woman said, placing figs and honey before the figure. She'll return. I wandered further, past bakeries and workshops, and into a crumbling temple once dedicated to Hathor. Now, faded paintings of Cleopatra had been scratched into the walls. Children left flowers there. Some had never even seen her, but they had heard. I sat among their offerings, stones, coins. An old man muttered, "The last true ruler. The rest are just uniforms." Later that week, I found myself back in the palace ruins. In a dark corridor, someone had carved words into the wall. She died, but did not vanish. I ran my paw along the letters. They were rough, fresh, even in death. Cleopatra had become something more, an idea no empire could burn. And I, her silent shadow, saw it begin. The first time I saw her name on a Roman scroll, I knew something was wrong. I was crouched on a windowsill of the governor's residence, the sea breeze ruffling my fur. As a Roman historian read aloud from a fresh parchment, he called her seductress, traitor, enemy of order. I hissed low under my breath. I had sat on her shoulder as she dictated laws. I had curled beneath her chair during nights of strategy and worry. Now, these men dipped their quills and rewrote her into something she was not. I jumped onto the table. When they weren't looking, pause, landing on the corner of a scroll, ink smeared. The scribe cursed. He pushed me off, but not before I scratched the edge of a wax tablet where her name had been misspelled. In the library, I followed young Roman scholars who had never seen her, never heard her voice, but spoke confidently about her arrogance and downfall. They didn't know the scent of her perfume, or the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when deep in thought. I did. They turned her into a shadow tool for Rome's glory. But every night, I wandered the quiet halls, placing my paw prints across the scrolls they left open. Their words might survive, but I, who had walked beside her, would remember the truth. The statue looked like her almost. I circled the pedestal in the atrium of a Roman villa, tail flicking with doubt. Her nose was too small, the crown wrong. They had made her softer, quieter, as if power didn't belong to her. Inside, a nobleman read poetry aloud, two guests reclining on couches. He called her the Snake Woman, the temptress of the Nile. I jumped onto the table between them, knocking over a bowl of olives. Startled laughter erupted, but I didn't flinch. One guest tossed a fig at me. I ignored it. I wandered through gallery halls filled with frescoes. Some painted her in fine robes, others surrounded by lions and serpents. None of them captured her silence in the throne room. None of them painted the way her fingers trembled when she sent her children away. Later, I crept into a studio where a sculptor worked by torchlight. He was trying to carve her likeness from memory. I leaped onto the edge of his workbench, watching his hands. He paused. "You knew her, didn't you?" he whispered, eyes on mine. I blinked slowly. He returned to his chisel, but this time he softened her brow, gave her eyes a flicker of defiance. Perhaps one artist, at least, remembered something true, and I, who had seen the real queen in her quietest hours, watched as myth was molded, line by line. Centuries passed. I never truly left. Stones shifted, walls crumbled, but I moved through dust and time like memory, with claws. Then, one day, new footsteps echoed, boots with rubber soles, voices speaking strange tongues. I crouched behind a broken pillar as humans in bright vests examined the ruins of the old palace. They called out names: Cleopatra, Alexandria, Lost Tomb. I followed them. They carried devices with blinking lights and dug carefully in places I used to sleep. One morning, a woman sat cross-legged beside a mosaic. She brushed dirt away from a face carved in tiles, shaped like the queen's. I stepped into the light. She gasped, dropping her brush. "A cat," she whispered, "just like in the temple paintings." I rubbed my head against the stone where Cleopatra once stood. It was cracked, but still warm from the sun. They mapped old tunnels I used to run through as a kitten. They opened scrolls, burned at the edges, lifting forgotten names like breath from Ashdod in one tent. I leaped onto a dusty table and sprawled across an open book. It showed a painting: Cleopatra, regal and wrong. I meowed. They laughed. But I wasn't joking. I was here when she ruled. And I am here as they dig through the past, chasing a queen they never truly knew. And I, who walked every step beside her, remain her last witness. I have walked these stones for years through power and ruin, glory and silence. I saw a queen born beneath temple walls, her eyes bright with hope and fire. I watched her fight for a kingdom, a people, a name. I smelled the scent of jasmine in her chambers, heard the whispers in the palace halls. felt the weight of empires shift beneath her feet. I chased shadows in the streets of Alexandria, dodged soldiers and traitors, and sat quietly as history was written and rewritten. I saw her children carried away. The city changed shape, and the world forget what once was. But I remember, not as humans write it, but as I lived it. A silent witness, a small shadow, a cat who walked beside Cleopatra.